Summer with the Rock Star. The Blue Bay Beach Reads Romance Series. Book 2. By Ellie Hall. Copyright 2019 Ellie Hall. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. Claudia. Claudia ducked out of the rain and into the austere stone building on Oak Street. It was the last day of music school for the summer, but that didn't mean the work for her master's degree was over. Once the final project was done, that's when her dreams would really start coming true. Her shoes squeaked on the polished granite floor as she made her way to class. Despite the unpleasant sound, a different melody hummed under her skin. It wasn't a song she'd been working on. Rather, it was a feeling of hope mixed with excitement. The kind of feeling when she'd made a wish on a star when she was a little girl. Never mind that she was in her 30s and by some standards too old to be getting her master's degree in music, or to be wishing on stars. As she settled into class, the professor was talking about his weekend spent fishing, which reminded her of a famous proverb. Give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Claudia chuckled softly. The young woman sitting next to her with her long hair twisted into braids turned in Claudia's direction. I don't think I've ever seen you so much as smile in this class. What's so funny? It's only 8 a.m., we're about to get our final assignment, and I was running late so I didn't get my caffeine fix. I could sure use a good laugh. I've smiled, Claudia said, thinking of the many times the professor had them analyze famous pieces. That carried her so far away from her thoughts she lost track of time. Although, her fellow student had a point. She rarely even chatted before or after class and rarely joined in when everyone gathered in the hall or down at the student center, after class. The girl with braids shook her head. I'm Trisha and I'm still waiting to get in on the joke. I'm Claudia and I'm sorry we haven't met earlier. I guess I've just taken this class too seriously. I'm a non-traditional student and her list of reasons came to mind about why she was focused, a planner, stayed organized, and regimented. Age is but a number. Trisha lifted and lowered her shoulder. My Aunt Margot always used to say that. Professor Prince's story about fishing reminded me of something else she used to say. That's what had me laughing. I'm waiting. Trisha drummed her fingers on the desk. Have you ever heard the saying if you give a man a fish? Trisha nodded. Prince has it on a poster in his office. But I always wondered what would happen if you gave a woman a fish. This is fitting then. Claudia smiled. My Aunt Margot used to say, give a woman a diamond, she'll love you as long as it sparkles. Teach a woman how to obtain her own jewels, she'll love herself for a lifetime. Oh, that's good. That's really good. Trisha laughed. Claudia felt a warm feeling, like a hug, come over her at the sound of Trisha laughing and the fond memories of her aunt. Margot Von Plata raised Claudia, and even though she could afford to send her to school, instead of doing so, she taught her everything she knew about hard work, creativity, and entrepreneurship. In other words, she taught Claudia how to obtain her own jewels, though that was still a work in progress. I think I like this Margot lady. She's the best. I'm hoping to visit her this summer if work and our project doesn't keep me too busy. I also think someone likes you. Trisha waggled her eyebrows then lifted her chin in the direction of a cute guy with glasses who chanced to look at Claudia every few seconds. He was probably almost a decade younger than Claudia since she was late to get her master's degree, but she had a youthful face. She'd been in and out of relationships, but they never stuck around for long. Maybe because they didn't understand her need for music. Professor Prince called for the class's attention. Claudia leaned forward, eager to find out what the professor would assign them for their final project in the class titled Bridging the Past, Present, and Future in Music. She thought the name was clever because a bridge was also a component of a song. Prince was famous in the academic world for being rogue, harsh, and hard to like, but he was also clever, and she'd learned more about music in that class than almost all her others. Just as Professor Prince started to explain, her phone jingled. She shuffled through her bag as it dinged with the classic retro song Tutti Frutti by Little Richard. Aunt Margot may have been a woman of class, but she also had a wicked sense of humor and insisted Claudia use that as her ringtone whenever her aunt called. It did bring a smile to her face, but her aunt knew she was in class. Maybe she forgot about the time difference? Claudia rifled through, trying to find the thing that kept blaring. Then her bag tipped, falling down the stairs of the aisle in the auditorium-style seating of the classroom. Her notebooks, lunch bag, a few random cosmetics, half a protein bar, several highlighters, an accordion stack of sticky notes, and her feminine hygiene products all tumbled out and onto the floor. The cute guy with glasses rushed out of his seat to help her. Meanwhile, her phone went on. Bop bopaloo a wop bamboo. A few people chucked. Claudia's face heated. The flattening of Mr. Prince's lips suggested that he was not amused. Interesting to note that you're a fan of Little Richard, Miss Von Plata. Now, if you'd kindly turn your phone off, I have a class to teach. She managed to find her phone, but just as soon as it stopped, it started ringing again. Her stomach jittered and sank as she wondered why her aunt would call again unless it was an emergency. As far as Claudia knew, Margot was in good health, but she was well into her 80s, nearing 90, and on the other side of the country. Even though Claudia silenced the phone, it continued to ring. She finished gathering up her belongings. I have to take this, she muttered, then rushed from the classroom. Hello, she said, once in the hallway and safe from Prince's wrath. Claudia, darling, Aunt Margot's once strong, clear voice sounded frail. Is everything okay? The jittering in her stomach went still and became heavy. Of course, darling. I took a little spill. Nothing too bad. They insisted on taking me to the hospital, but it seems my insurance premium wasn't paid. The kind nurse here won't let me go home unless I have someone to see to my care. I don't want to burden you, but I'm wondering if you can help me put my affairs in order. Aunt Margot had never asked Claudia for anything other than for her smile. Of course, I'll be there as soon as possible. She'd been planning on traveling to Florida during the summer and envisioned working on her project on the lanai of Aunt Margot's mansion, overlooking the Gulf of Mexico. She'd have to get the details from her professor later. Aunt Margot had always been there for her, so she rushed down Oak Street to her apartment, going through a mental list of all she needed to do before she got on the airplane. At an obscenely early hour the next morning, Claudia emerged from the airport and into a wall of humid Florida air. She smoothed her long dark hair. There was no time to think about how it was likely frizzy or about the few grays she'd found earlier that week. There were just a few. 3 to be exact, she reminded herself as she made her way to the car rental desk. Aunt Margot's voice floated into her head. Age is just a number. Right then, exhausted and worried, she struggled with her aunt's particularly advanced number and how she'd fallen down and was in the hospital. She didn't want to think about anything happening to her aunt. An hour after that, Claudia arrived at the hospital to find her aunt fast asleep. She consulted the nurses, who informed her Margot was doing just fine, except she'd fractured her hip. The week she's been here has been the most fun we've had on this floor in a long time. She is hysterical, a nurse in lavender scrubs said. Another nurse piped up. She has the best stories. Claudia smiled with relief. Margot Von Plata did have the best stories. Other than her hip, as far as her overall health goes, she's in good shape. The nurse in lavender reviewed a chart. Our concern is with her finances. As you may know, her insurance didn't go through and we've detected the signs of dementia. The nurse went on to explain how it was common at that stage of her life and the support available for both her aunt and loved ones. Claudia's stomach nodded again. The nurse gripped her shoulder. She's still the aunt you've always known and loved, but from our end, there have been occasions when she's been confused about time, place, and basic things we'd seen her do before. But when I spoke to her on the phone, Claudia's throat felt scratchy. Most of the time she's as sharp as a tack if not a bit sleepy, but then there are others when it seems like she's slipping. Given she had the best insurance money could buy, we imagine she lapsed in payment because her affairs are getting away from her, the other nurse said delicately. She's lucky to have you. The first nurse, wearing lavender, Aunt Margot's favorite color, squeezed Claudia's shoulder again. Listen, she's a special woman. Anyone who spends more than a minute in a room with her knows that. This isn't unusual at her age. Keep in mind that she's otherwise healthy. That's something to be grateful for. Tears brimmed in Claudia's eyes, but she nodded because the nurse was right. She just couldn't imagine her larger-than-life aunt being anything less than, well, impeccable in every way. She wouldn't let herself even think about how they referred to her advanced age and what it meant for the future. She sat with her aunt while she slept. Even though Margot had moved to Florida where it was much sunnier than her native Montreal, she took great care of her skin. However, the wrinkles were more pronounced than last time they'd been together and she hadn't been to the hair salon to have her roots touched up in a while, which was extremely unlike her. She was the kind of woman who still dressed as though she were meeting the Queen and never had so much as a hair out of place. Claudia sighed. Perhaps the nurses were right. Aunt Margot slowly roused then sat upright. Darling, there you are. I apologize. I must have drifted off while I was waiting for you. What took you so long? It's only a short drive from home. Tears tickled Claudia's eyes. Aunt Margot's comment confirmed the nurse's concerns. I flew from San Francisco. But I'm sure glad to be out of the rain and with you. You bring the sunshine with you wherever you go with that smile of yours, darling. Come, let's get out of here. She suddenly seemed more lucid and able-bodied as she got out of bed. But as she moved to get to her feet, it was as though she forgot she'd injured her hip and Claudia caught her before she slipped. Aunt Margot had always been slender, but she felt small and frail in Claudia's arms. She continued to fight back tears. Together with the nurses, she prepared to bring her aunt home, not sure what she'd find, but hoped it would be the money to pay her aunt's bills. The drive to Blue Bay Beach took about 45 minutes. Aunt Margot chatted for the first few miles then dozed off. Claudia's mind raced. Logically, she knew her aunt would age, but she'd never imagined the reality of the changes. As the crescent-shaped bay came into view, a sigh escaped. The tension in Claudia's shoulders relaxed at the sound of the waves rolling into shore. The late-day sun dusted the palmy jungle surrounding the mansion homes on the outskirts of the small town. Blue Bay Beach was a hidden gem among the many beaches along the Gulf Coast of Florida. Claudia had been there once, but mostly she visited her aunt at her estate in Montreal, especially during the holiday season. Margot insisted Christmas wasn't the same without snow. Claudia punched the gate key code. Aunt Margot, we're home. She stirred and lit up. Ah, this is a better view than the one in the hospital. 3 adorable but yappy dogs greeted them as they entered. I hope Louis was feeding them. At the name, Claudia halted. Perhaps her aunt's memory was worse than she'd thought. After getting Margot and the dogs settled, they had lunch. Claudia heard all about the last few weeks leading up to Margot's spill. From the sounds of things, she was as busy as ever with her social calendar and seemed lucid, but didn't eat too much of her Niçoise salad, her favorite. However, a pile of mail was on the counter and at first glance, many of them were bills and past due notices. "You'll stay a while, darling, won't you? I think you'll like it here." Margot smiled. "I'll stay as long as you need me." Claudia's breath caught in her chest because there was no denying the once strong and independent hero in her life required help. Maybe she'd stay even longer. The bell rang, and the housekeeper entered, her face drawn in an expression of worry and concern. "I'm so glad to see you home, Miss Margot. I'm as fit as a fiddle." Claudia smiled and introduced herself. "Are you Miss Lewis?" The woman's brow creased. "No, my name is Esmeralda. She's the best around. In fact, she helped me when I fell and looked after Bella, Bear, and Lulu." "Thank you, Esmeralda," Claudia said. Something flashed across the housekeeper's face, but she quickly pasted on a smile. "Of course." She excused herself to her chores, leaving Claudia and Margot to their lunch. The rest of the time spent at the table consisted of stories, some of Claudia's favorites that she didn't mind hearing again, and a new one about a date Margot once had with a duke. There had been a gaggle of geese involved and a lost shoe. Another story was about a famous rock star, Margot wouldn't say who. Claudia had heard the story at dinners with guests from the music industry and gleaned that the mystery man was none other than a certain hunka-hunka burning love. As her laughter faded, Claudia steeled her nerves. "Aunt Margot, have you heard from Lewis?" Despite her aunt's lapse in memory, the stories she'd heard were all true and her aunt was as lucid as ever, at least in that moment. Perhaps her comment earlier was a slip. She hoped so. "Who?" Margot asked as she finished her raspberry iced tea. A ragged breath escaped Claudia that was part worry and part relief. She decided to ignore it for the time being. Later, Margot said she'd retire early after the ordeal at the hospital and the excitement of returning home. After saying goodnight to her aunt, Claudia was restless. Even though her aunt didn't seem to recall Lewis, she'd mentioned his name and they certainly knew him and knew him well. Claudia wandered down the hall and past framed photos of her aunt with famous celebrities, mostly musicians, including Elvis Presley, a few of the Beatles, and Aretha Franklin. Margot was a self-made woman and believed anyone could create the life of their dreams by working hard. She'd made several timely real estate investments, earned millions in the tech boom, and had invested it wisely. She went from being a music club promoter in the 60s to a publicist in the 70s, to an agent in the 80s, and eventually became a consultant in the industry for everything. She was the financial backer for a few websites and blam. Millions more in the bank. Margot was used to fame and divas but didn't take any sass. She certainly didn't grovel, and in an industry where that was often expected, it turned out that her attitude was respected. She was a lady of class and an entrepreneur as well as Claudia's idol. Although Claudia grew up around the popular music of her time, she preferred the structure and order of the classical music world and threw herself headfirst into it, even though some of her courses took her back into pop and rock, even country on occasion. Margot may have been able to deal with the many personalities of that subset of the music industry, but Claudia had experienced enough chaos in her life and didn't want much to do with it. From somewhere in the house, one of the dogs yapped a few times then went silent. Claudia entered her aunt's office. Ordinarily, she'd never do so without Margot's permission, but things had changed and since her aunt was behind on payments, something she had always been on top of, Claudia felt the need to investigate. As she went through the mail, Claudia's stomach clenched. Her aunt hadn't paid bills in at least 3 months. She logged onto the computer to find some of her aunt's passwords saved. The bank account was overdrawn. Further investigation proved that her aunt's financial situation was in a dire state. Claudia traced through her memory. She'd missed her last visit during spring break because she was busy with work and school, but had last seen her aunt at Christmas time. They spoke weekly on the phone, usually Sunday after church, but the calls had become sporadic. Claudia didn't think much of it because she was so busy and figured, true to form, Margot was too. "What happened?" "Where's all the money?" she whispered. Claudia was exhausted but forced herself to go through files and more unopened mail, trying to make sense of it all. She came across the official documents for her adoption. Her aunt had tried to talk her birth parents into doing the right thing and quickly learned that even money didn't always get you what you wanted, so she fought for custody. Because of her early life, Claudia was practical. She couldn't sort out the mysterious disappearance of her aunt's wealth right then, but she would get to the bottom of it. There was a chance Margot donated it all to a dog rescue. She loved the animals. Considering her mental slips, it was possible. Perhaps she made a bad investment or the accounts got mixed up. Claudia wasn't sure. But she did know what to do right then. She went into survival mode. She'd done it before. She clicked online to the local paper and found the job listings. The next day, after spending some time with her aunt, Claudia drove her rental car into town. She'd forgotten parking was limited in Blue Bay Beach since walking was encouraged. She parked nearly as far away as she would have had she just gone on foot from Mansion Mile. She hurried down the quaint street with its pastel shops selling beach gear, a bakery, boutique, and the Sandy Shore Inn. She practically ran down the dock, jutting into the crystal blue water. A restaurant with a thatched roof was at the very end. It had a patio on the side for outdoor dining. Claudia had waited tables in the past and hoped it would provide enough of an income, combined with her modest savings, to keep her and her aunt afloat until she figured things out. Claudia waited at the register station and twisted her bulky watch to see the time. It was oversized for her slim wrist, but she refused to take it off unless she was playing the piano. Even then, she sometimes left the reminder in place. The windows of the restaurant opened to the ocean and a gentle breeze wafted the delicious scent of coconut through the air. Claudia took a deep breath, preparing herself. She perused the menu and her stomach growled. The Coconut Cove Café offered breakfast, lunch, and dinner. A pretty woman with hair that was somewhere between blonde and brown hurried into the restaurant. They both waited in silence until a third woman, wearing an apron and a t-shirt with the restaurant's name, introduced herself. "I'm Billy. I own this place and am looking for summer help. Is that the two of you?" She pointed at Claudia and the other woman. They started to answer at the same time. Billy's sharp eyes seemed to be on them and everything else going on in the restaurant at once. She lifted her hands to stop them from saying more, as though she didn't have time to hear their life stories. "Do you speak English?" she asked. They both nodded then said, "Yes," in unison. "Are you literate?" Again, they both nodded. "What's the greatest movie of all time?" "Mamma Mia," the other woman said. "The Summer House," Claudia answered. It was her guilty pleasure because it was the perfect romantic movie and every time she watched it, she polished off a whole pint of ice cream. Billy nodded approvingly. "That'll do. You're hired. Can you start now? Betty is here today and she can show you the ropes." She didn't wait for an answer but went to the kitchen window and slid a slip on the counter, slapped it, and called, "Order in." The next hour was a whirlwind of training from an older woman named Betty with a shock of white hair pulled back in a clip and with bangs. Claudia managed to mess up a few orders. While she was fretting over that, she somehow found herself involved in a new employee initiation led by Betty. "I'm not looking to date," she was about to explain the situation with her aunt and how she'd only arrived in town the day before, but Isley, the other new girl, was thrust onto the floor where she had to ask the next guy she waited on out on a date. Claudia's stomach tied itself up. Isley's head tipped back and as she looked over her shoulder it was obvious that she was equally stressed about the dare. Sure, Claudia wanted to find the guy to sweep her off her feet, to understand her, to be a companion, to dream with and create a life together, but she didn't think she'd meet him in a cafe.
Chapter 2. Carter. Wilde Westcott hummed to himself as he slipped down the alley behind the stucco building, ducked behind several cars, and then threw himself behind the bushes at the sound of someone shouting. The midsummer humidity instantly caused his clothing to cling to his skin. He had nothing but his phone in his hand and as the voice activation robot lady asked if she could help him, he practically smashed the thing on the ground, afraid it would give away his location. But no, it was his lifeline. Actually, lifeline wasn't the correct term. It was the thing that had gotten him into the mess he found himself in and what he hoped would get him out of it. No, that wasn't right either. Although he'd long ago given up on hope, deep down he knew he was the one responsible for his current situation and he had to get himself out of it. As the voices shouting grew louder, he rushed through the bushes, hoping he didn't encounter any alligators or crocodiles or whatever it was that lurked in the swamps of southern Florida. Just as soon as he got clear of the shrubbery, he waited to cross a busy road. He considered thumbing a ride, but he'd be recognized. Even with the hat and sunglasses, anyone would identify his voice. He couldn't afford that. As he continued to walk, putting what amounted to miles between him and the center, he considered what his lifestyle afforded him, including a yacht, global travel, the Ferrari and an assortment of other luxury cars, and of course, his houses on 6 of the 7 continents. But the high cost of all of that had been indulging fame and its many facades and trappings. He wasn't sure that's what he wanted anymore. He chuckled darkly at the things he'd done to become the musician known as Wilde. He wasn't sure that he had enough money to buy back his anonymity, his privacy, and the ability to walk into a town without being swarmed by fans, which inevitably led to the arrival of the paparazzi. But he'd give nearly anything to have that ability again. Behind those thoughts was a question: could he buy back his self-respect? Or was that something he'd have to earn? His parents' voices chorused in his head, telling him to do the right thing. If only they were still around in real life and not merely shadows in his memory. As Carter wandered down unfamiliar streets, taking random turns when cars would approach, he got lost in his thoughts. He just wanted a few minutes to himself without the questions, the cameras, and all the noise. Was that too much to ask? He just wanted time with his parents, but that wasn't going to happen, so where did that leave him? Carter blinked a few times, realizing he was actually lost. But wasn't that what he wanted? To get away, if even for a few minutes? He continued walking toward a thick stretch of woods. He supposed he could go to some remote locale, change his name, and drop off the grid. Then again, the cameras were sure to find him. They always did. He had a way of attracting them, even though he'd recently grown tired of the attention. Years ago, it started with his voice. Then as he grew into his good looks, the ladies couldn't stay away. He didn't mean to become one of the biggest names in music, but he hadn't avoided it either. There were many points in Carter's life when he greedily drew attention to himself or went along with what his team suggested, no matter how outlandish, including agreeing to do the most recent project, which he immediately knew was a step in the wrong direction. He listened to a lot of the people in his life, and as he stood at the edge of the other side of the woods, it was time to start listening to himself and shutting the others out. If he'd done so, maybe he wouldn't be in his present situation and on the run. No, Wilde. You got yourself there just as you got yourself here, he muttered. It was only when he was actually alone that he found he could truly be honest with himself. Otherwise, it was just his agent, manager, Joey, the publicist, and the many people in his life piling on their advice and opinions, which often turned into pressure. He didn't want to let anyone down. It wasn't that he was ungrateful for all that he'd accomplished in the music industry, but somewhere along the way it had stopped being about music and started being about money. And somewhere along the way, Carter had gotten lost. As the backs of several mansions came into view, he wasn't entirely mad about that. He may not have been able to afford privacy, but he could afford one of the massive estates, which meant he had some leverage in his life where many people did not. He didn't want anyone to think he was a burglar, so he sauntered around one property and onto the sandy road on the other side. The bluest, most crystal clear water filled the horizon. A seagull called from nearby and waves rolled to a white sand shore. Carter took the deepest breath he could, and with it, he drew something into his chest he'd all but abandoned. This road to ruin hasn't been paving itself, and as they say, it has to get worse before it gets better. But it was hope that flared, suggesting it would get better. He crossed to a beach and ignored the sign that said private. He kicked off his boots. Feeling the sand between his toes and the warm water lapping his ankles made him feel like a new man. Could someone like him start over? Get a second chance? It was still early in the day as he walked into the beach town. He passed a church and before continuing on, he stepped inside. The space was quiet and had a reverent feel, even though it was empty. He slipped into a pew and dropped to his knees. He hadn't assumed that position since he'd lost his parents. It had been decades since he'd been to church with them. Despite his face splashed across magazines, billboards, and the internet, he wasn't sure they'd recognize their son. But as Carter pressed his palms together, he had the sudden and shocking sense that God knew him. Tears brimmed in his eyes. He exhaled sharply, not ready to feel the welling of emotion. He got to his feet and left the church. As Carter walked down the main street, he passed Blue Bay Beach Supplies and Souvenirs, Blue and Blonde Boutique, and spotted a sign for a breakfast joint called Coconut Cove Café. He continued on, down a dock, and entered the establishment. A sign indicated that he seat himself, so he took a table away from the others. Even before a member of the waitstaff was able to approach him, a family with 2 teenage girls sat down nearby. Not wanting to risk being spotted, he shifted so his back was to them. The view out the window was of endless blue ocean that stretched in every direction. It was as though he could get up from his chair and walk and walk and walk on the water forever. Walk away from his troubles. Walk away from his past. A tune came into his mind along with some lyrics and he jotted them on the napkin. Usually, he recorded his ideas into his phone, but he didn't want someone overhearing him. But Carter's thoughts of musical inspiration weren't enough to distract him from hearing his own name. He stiffened. "Mom, he's gone missing," said a teen girl who was seated at the nearby table. "Who's gone missing, honey?" "Duh. Wilde," the second girl said. The mother sighed. "That young man has sure gotten himself in trouble. I'm not so sure I like you listening to his music anymore." Carter didn't like the way that made him feel slimy all over. "Well, there are rumors that the whole thing about him being sent to a rehab center was fake," girl 1 said. "If he really had all those problems, do you think he'd be able to write and sing such amazing songs?" Girl 2 said. Despite himself, Carter smiled. "He probably has a team of people writing his music," the father said. Carter clenched his fists. He'd written every note, every lyric, and arranged every hit. It was all him. Yes, he had a problem, but it wasn't with drugs or alcohol as the public had been led to believe. It was true, he was broken, but when he looked up, an angel stood in front of him. He was sure she was just the person to fix him. She had dark hair, chocolate eyes, a strong jaw, and legs for days. But what he noticed the most were her slender fingers holding the order pad and pen. She glanced over her shoulder then swallowed. "Hi, can I take your order?" Panic seized him as he worried that she recognized him. As the seconds passed, if that were the case, she'd be screaming, crying, giggling nervously, or asking for his autograph or to bear his child. It had happened often enough. Instead, she shifted from foot to foot as though uncomfortable or irritated. "Something to drink," she said when he didn't answer. She had the cutest gap in her 2 front teeth, but she didn't smile. Carter cleared his throat. Yeah. I'd like to order a pina colada." He tried to disguise his accent to sound southern. It sounded terrible and would have passed had he been out all night then washed up on the shore. Close enough to the truth. "You can add some rum while you're at it," he added. She cocked her hip. "I'm sorry we don't serve that." She twisted the oversized masculine watch on her wrist. "Also, it's 7 in the morning." A smile played on Carter's lips. Women threw themselves at him and often he was happy to catch them, but rarely were they not interested. Even rarer was there a time when he was truly enamored. Yeah, that was the right word. The waitress captivated him with her alert brown eyes, perfect nose, and those lips. Oh, those lips. "If you look here, we have an assortment of breakfast items." She leaned over him and her cascade of hair tickled his cheek as she pointed at the menu. He smiled. "We have a pina colada. It's a smoothie that has pineapple, coconut, and avocado, hence the colado-like avocado. Is it like a milkshake? I could go for one of those." She planted her hand on her hip. There's a place up the beach for milkshakes, but they are not open yet. I was just teasing. I'll take the smoothie and try to be healthy for once. He closed the menu. He was going to ask her for her number and add it to the lyrics on his napkin. She blurted, "Thank you. Also, well, I'm supposed to ask if you'd like to go on a date." Her cheeks burned bright red.
Chapter 3. Claudia. Once the question was out about asking the customer on the date, Claudia couldn't stop rambling as her cheeks grew warmer and warmer. "It's just this silly dare here at the restaurant. Last month Isley had to go out with the first customer she waited on, and now they're getting married and, well, it's my turn, so don't worry if it's a no. I just had to do it, so I'll be back with your order in a jiffy." Jiffy? Who used the word jiffy? Sweat pierced her hairline. Even with the ocean breeze, the air was still humid, and seeing as she'd never asked a guy out before, it felt extra thick. As she rushed to the kitchen to put in the guy's order, she tried to take deep breaths. "You passed the test," said Betty, her coworker and the grandmaster instigator of the whole dating dare. "Does that mean I don't have to actually go on a date with him?" Desperation entered her tone. "Of course you do. Those are the rules." Isley did, and now it's your turn. Betty smiled mischievously. Isley happened to know the guy she waited on, Billy pointed out. Isley, a slim woman with honey brown eyes, poked her head between them. "Remember, I didn't know it was him at the time," she said, referring to her longtime friend Ford and now her husband. "True, but for all I know he could be an ogre under his sunglasses and hat." Claudia gestured to the guy at the table by the window. "But he's well built." Not like an athlete or a marine, Isley lifted and lowered her eyebrows because her husband was the latter. "But he looks like he takes care of himself. In my day, I was a sucker for a guy's voice." Betty started to sing along to the song from the 60s playing on the restaurant's radio. She always tuned to that station during her shift. Earlier in the summer, the restaurant hosted a beach blast from the past party, and as the night had worn on, Betty and her husband, Gus, sang a duet of some oldies. It warmed Claudia's heart because they were adorable up there together. That was something she'd always wanted and envisioned, being able to sing with her true love like that, and boy, could Gus croon. He didn't sound like Gus, Betty. Claudia stuck out her tongue. He sounded like a seagull being strangled. The cook called Claudia's name for the smoothie, and she begged the others to bring it to the customer. They were all suddenly busy bringing refills, bussing tables, and getting change. Claudia approached the guy by the window slowly, willing her nerves to calm. She set the pina colada smoothie down next to the customer she'd completely embarrassed herself in front of when she'd asked him on a date. The smoothie was in a coconut shell cup and had all manner of umbrellas, straws, and other colorful decorations poking out of it. He still wore his glasses and hat, but she got a good look at his jaw, which was strong and lined with a few days' worth of stubble. The visible bits of his hair were a medium shade of brown and a bit shaggy. Mostly, though, she focused on his lips. She was drawn to them. They were pouty and perfect when he said, "Thank you." She imagined kissing him. There was something about his voice, after all. Claudia shook her head to snap herself out of it. She had been struggling for the last month to keep up with her new job, her aunt's care, the financial mess she was slowly sifting through, and nervously waiting to find out about her master's degree project. She'd applied for an extension, but expected an email or call from Professor Prince anytime to discuss the parameters of the project. Had she simply been visiting the beach town, she'd have been delighted to go on a date, but she was no longer in the market despite Betty's initiation. She had her aunt to take care of. "Can I get you anything else?" Claudia asked. "I'll take your number," Hot Lips said. She continued to shake her head. For that date you asked me on, he added. His voice no longer sounded like a dying bird but had a melodiousness that was both intriguing and mesmerizing. Oh, right. She scribbled down a fake name and number on the back of an order slip. She'd tell the girls he never called and voila, she'd have held up her end of the dare and gotten out of the situation. She was in no position to date despite what she could see of his good looks. Before long, he paid, and on his way out said, "I'll call you soon." Betty and Isley rushed over. Billy smirked from behind the register. His voice, Betty said. "I almost feel like I've heard it before," Isley added. "It was dreamy," Betty said as though she was 16 all over again. It sure was, but it would remain just that, a dream, because Claudia had too much going on to entertain a date with a handsome guy like Hot Lips. After she told her coworkers how he'd asked for her number, she floated through the rest of the afternoon because Betty was right. His lips and his voice, at least after that first time he'd spoken, were indeed dreamy. Later that day, as Claudia was leaving the restaurant, her phone beeped. She got the email she'd been expecting from her professor. He skipped pleasantries and went straight into the details. The final assignment, through research and a series of interviews, you are going to explore the life of a prominent musician. Your assignment is to learn what brought them to where they are today and get a sense of where they're going in the future. In other words, you'll be bridging the past, present, and future. Whoever springs to mind, whoever you're scheming about who you'll research and interview, stop. I've saved you the trouble. Because of your delay and extension, I've selected a subject for you. He happens to be in Florida as well. I promise this is the only part of this assignment that's going to be easy. The details for every stage of the assignment are in the attached packet. Claudia opened it and stopped swiping when she reached the 5th page. There were 5 more. She went back to the email. You will be documenting all of your sources. You will conduct at least 3 20-minute interviews in various settings. For example, a casual place such as a coffee shop or setting where they feel most in their element. Each of these places and how your subject behaves in them gives you vital information about who they are beyond what they tell you. Exceptions, of course, is if your subject is incarcerated or otherwise unable to leave their current residence or facility, in which case, you'll do the interviews at that location. The culmination of your interviews will be a 10-page paper combining your research and interviews along with an original composition, inspired by their music and what you learned about them. Bonus point for a duet with your subject. Contact information for your subject to follow. Claudia pressed her head into her hands. Basically, her professor was asking the impossible. For one thing, she didn't perform with anyone or in front of anyone, and certainly not an original composition. Sure, she could demonstrate a sample of a famous piece and practiced plenty to keep up her piano playing chops while at school, but she'd never shared her work or a piano bench with another musician. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't. She signed into the student portal, an online space where she could find out about events at school, check on her grades, and communicate with professors and other students. She wished she'd become friends with Trisha sooner, but she had to reach out and ask about this project. She found her phone number and tapped out a text. Hi Trisha, this is Claudia from Prince's class. I'm the one who embarrassed herself and then had to leave suddenly. It turned out that my aunt was sick and I had to take a leave of absence. I just got the assignment today though and am freaking out. I hope that you are not freaking out and are enjoying the summer. A few minutes later came Trisha's response. Sorry to hear about your aunt, but glad to hear from you. I'm convinced Prince has it in for us. I got the biggest diva in show business, but luckily, I know how to deal with divas. LOL. We're not allowed to tell who we were assigned until we're done. Good luck though, you'll probably need it. Claudia sighed as she walked home. Strictly speaking, she didn't have to get her master's degree. But playing music and teaching it was in her bones. It was her dream to share her love of it with students and take it even further through programs in schools and communities that were underserved. Music had saved her life and she wanted to pay it forward. It was all she could see herself doing. She certainly didn't want to wait tables for the rest of her life. Although given Aunt Margot's sudden lack of money, it looks like that was exactly what she'd be doing. She'd been able to trace some of the money and saw that it had been transferred to another account, but it was encrypted. The two women had briefly discussed finances, but as the weeks had passed, Margot had slipped more and more into her own world and often forgot details, information, and conversations. Claudia was able to piece things together and had torn apart the office, searching for info and clues as to what could have happened to all the money, but she came up as empty as Aunt Margot's bank account. The next day, Claudia got another email from Professor Prince. When she read the single sentence, she gasped. "You've been assigned Wilde. He owes me a favor, so it shouldn't be any trouble getting a hold of him." There was a contact number and that was it. No way. If his name weren't Wilde, his name would have been Trouble. Maybe it was his middle name. No way. What, darling? Aunt Margot asked. That's what I told Louis. No way. At the mention of that name again, Claudia spun to face her aunt who sat with her on the lanai. What? What do you mean that's what you told Louis? She struggled to keep her voice calm. It was as though Aunt Margot's eyes glazed over. I was thinking the dogs should be let out soon. It might rain later. Aunt Margot, please tell me what you meant about Louis. Bella, Bear, and Lulu probably need some fresh air. Of course they do. Although Claudia was frustrated, she smiled. Her aunt was the best person in her life and she loved her so much. It pained her to see the changes, but she couldn't get upset with her. I'll go let them out unless you'd like to come downstairs with me. You go on, darling. Would you like me to bring you some iced tea when I come back? Margot nodded. That would be wonderful. Claudia let the 3 fluffy dogs out the back door. The gardens were beautiful and symbolized how much her aunt had achieved, despite the financial woes. Margot had built the life of her dreams, and had the stories of adventures with rock stars and musicians, travels to faraway lands, and a quiet little retirement with her 3 dogs to prove it. Tears pricked Claudia's eyes, but all of her aunt's wisdom and strength made her brush them away. Aunt Margot didn't raise me to give up or get upset when things get tough. She helped me to be strong, she whispered. Claudia pushed back her shoulders and pulled out her phone. As daunting as the assignment from Professor Prince was, she'd do it. She'd get her master's degree. She'd reach new heights and live the life of her dreams too. She punched the numbers for the contact info she'd received into her cell. As the phone rang, it felt strange knowing quite a bit about a person even though they'd never met. Being a musician herself made her pay attention to well-structured songs, but it was impossible to live in the modern world and not know who Wilde was. Even if he had a team of people writing his music for him, there was no denying his talent. Nonetheless, he wasn't particularly private. His face was on every tabloid and he made internet headlines weekly. "Hello," Wilde answered. The word was simple. One spoken countless times every day. It was English, but British English, and with those double syllables Claudia would have been smitten if it weren't for what she knew about the speaker, even before she started doing the research for her project. Wilde was, well, wild and known for being a bad boy rock star. His reputation was as big as his ego, and aside from the fact that he was handsome, had a mesmerizing voice, and was genuinely skilled, she wanted little to do with him other than to complete her assignment. He was the kind of person Aunt Margot could have tamed in her prime. However, Claudia didn't have the patience or fortitude for guys like him. "Hi," she replied. "My name is Claudia Von Plata and I'm in the master's degree program at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music." "Fancy," Wilde interjected in a languid, musical tone. Claudia ignored the way yet another word from his mouth practically took her breath away. "My professor, Hugo Prince, assigned me to contact you for my final project. He said you owed him a favor." "Hugo," Wilde said. "Ah, we go way back. Met at a gig in Rio years ago." "Prince played a gig?" As the question was out of her mouth, she knew she was off topic even though nothing about her uptight professor suggested he played rock and roll. Then again, he was roguish, rebellious, and assigned the most insane project ever, so she supposed it was possible. "Yeah. He said one of his students would be in touch. Do you have time for an interview?" Claudia asked. "Love, I have all the time in the world." Tingles shot through her like heat lightning. She cleared her throat. "Great. So we can get started. When did you first start playing music?" "Actually, I only conduct interviews in person." "Oh. Okay. I'm kind of juggling a lot right now." "Where are you? Because if it's far it would be great if you could make an exception. Perhaps we could do a video chat." "I'm outside Miami and no exceptions." His tone wasn't stern, but rather teasing, as though everything he said was a way to amuse himself. Relief swept through Claudia. "Okay, I'm just north of Miami." He gave her the address. "See you soon, love." That heat lightning had bottled itself up and threatened to explode out of Claudia. She took a deep breath to calm herself, because no way was she going to let a guy like Wilde with his dreamy voice distract her.
Chapter 4. Carter. Despite Carter's best efforts at remaining off the radar of fans, management, and paparazzi, his stint in the quiet seaside village of Blue Bay Beach was brief. He didn't even have the opportunity to check into a hotel when someone spotted him leaving Coconut Cove Café, snapped a few photos, and splashed them all over social media. His management team instantly tracked him down. He expected them to be upset, but they were beyond pleased for several reasons. Among them being his stunt was true to form and the Wilde brand. They said his wild antics drove up interest and therefore ratings, as well as serving as another discussion topic on the show Rockers in Rehab that he'd agreed to do and subsequently regretted, prompting his little escape. There were two truths and one lie tied up in that messy situation. Truths: he was a rocker and he did need rehab, but not because of a drug or alcohol problem. He needed to rehabilitate his career, and maybe his spirit, like one might an old house. The bones were good, but the rest had fallen into shambles, though everyone around him thought it was great entertainment. The lie was the one he was living out daily. Keeping up the image, fabricating stories to amp up his reputation and sell more records was tiresome, made him feel slimy, and to be honest, he was bored with the whole thing. He missed fooling around with his guitar and his best mates, jamming and recording new music instead of pumping out more and more to feed the hungry fans and fame beast. As he waited for Claudia Von Plata, an honest-to-goodness music student, he played with the sound of her name in his mouth. It had a musical quality, but with an edge to it. He hoped that she did not and would go along with his plan. As he waited in the common room of the rehab center, a couple of the other rockers on the show goofed off at the ping-pong table, 2 others played a video game, and the rest were probably in their counseling sessions or being interviewed for the private confessionals featured on the show. Carter was a musician, which meant he was also a storyteller and had no problem weaving tales of debauchery and excess, but it was getting old and felt like stale crackers in his mouth. Never mind the fact that most of them were embellishments of the truth or outright lies. His manager, Joey, insisted it was what sold. He wanted to think his music was what brought in the cash, but everyone around him insisted it was the Wilde persona. Would he tell Miss Von Plata the truth or keep churning out the trash? An aide entered the room and stalked over to him. "Mr. Wilde, you have a visitor." The ample woman stepped aside and the brunette from the restaurant, the one with the long legs and the adorable gap between her teeth, stood in front of him. Have mercy. She was gorgeous. He probably didn't notice the first time because not being recognized preoccupied him. She blinked a few times. "Have a seat, love." His lips quirked. Of all the luck. She hesitated before lowering into the metal chair. "Just so we're clear, I apologize for not calling." He snapped his fingers. "Wait. Is it Claudia or Alice? You definitely seem more like a Claudia." He liked the way her name sounded falling from his lips. By the slow blink of her long-lashed eyes, it seemed she liked the sound of his voice too. The space between her eyebrows creased. "Alice? The name you wrote on the paper with your number. I would have called, but as you can see, I'm a bit confined at the moment." A beat passed before it seemed like she made the connection that he'd made the moment she'd walked in. The girl who worked at the restaurant was the same one who'd called to interview him. He suddenly grew suspicious. Countless people had tried to take advantage of him over the years. Many still did. Then he made another connection. She'd given him a fake name and number after she'd nervously asked him on a date. He wanted to be mad, but he'd been giving a fake name and cultivating his fake character for years. She skipped acknowledging the situation, any further pleasantries, and took out a notebook. "Can we get right to it?" He leaned back in the chair, taking a long sip of her gorgeousness. That was the first and only word that came to mind. The woman opposite him was gorgeous. However, she had a shy reservedness that made him think she didn't realize her own beauty. His chest stuttered, but he played it cool. "What do you have for me, love?" "Oh, wait, just sign these papers." He slid a few sheets across the table, leaned over the content, and pointed at the line where she'd sign. "Just non-disclosure nonsense and that kind of thing. Don't want you sharing anything I say that's off the record, right?" She scribbled her name, but he couldn't tell if it was Alice or Claudia. "Ready?" Without waiting for him to answer, she asked, "Favorite color?" Carter scratched his temple. "Snogging." She started writing the answer down, then looked up. "What?" "Snogging. It's the British term for kissing," he explained. "I know what it means, but it's not a color." He shrugged. "Next question." "Favorite food?" "Snogging." "Wilde, that's not food." Forced calm threaded her voice. He tilted his head, narrowed his eyes, and smiled. He couldn't see his reflection, but the shift in her expression suggested the Wilde smolder was in full effect. It usually reduced women to wanting nothing more than to, well, snog him. "You've never conducted an interview before, huh?" "Not exactly." "Does it matter?" "What's your favorite place?" "Snogging." She exhaled irritably. "Why do you keep saying that? Why do you keep asking me these stupid questions? No one cares about them. They are to get to know you." The inflection in her tone, the way she said it, and what it implied stirred something inside of him. "How about if you ask me a question, you also have to answer it?" "Fine." He cut across her. "What's your name?" "I told you. It's Claudia Von Plata." "Not Alice?" "No. I didn't realize that was you. It was just a stupid work thing." "Never mind. When did you start playing music?" "Ah, now we're moving on to more interesting stuff. But you can find the answer to this in every interview I've ever conducted. I have to admit, you're not very good at this." He chuckled, so she'd know he was teasing and sense he was infuriating her, but he couldn't help himself. The blush that rose to her cheeks made him heat up all over. Your turn. Answer. She nearly rolled her eyes. I started playing music when I was 3. On a metal bowl in the kitchen. I graduated to the piano in 3rd grade when the neighbor took me in. Then in 5th grade, I started on stringed instruments. Mastered every single one. You're a musician? His eyebrow lifted higher. I go to the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. Yes, it's safe to say I know my way around an instrument or two. Carter sat up and leaned on the table. He'd forgotten she'd mentioned that during her original call. His tongue was tied for an instant, a rarity for a guy whose voice was his career. She'd silenced him. For the briefest moment, he felt relieved at not having to be the one in control of the situation. But that's not who he'd been created to be. Impressive. We should jam sometime. That's the point of this project. Did Prince tell you? She asked. Carter remembered a vague email exchange. He sure did, but he failed to mention that you're gorgeous. Her cheeks blazed and her hair fell in front of her face as she stared at her notebook. There, he had the upper hand again. That's where he was most comfortable, steering the situation and conversation. Next question, she mumbled. Who do you owe your greatest musical inspiration? Gorgeous women like you. You're exhausting, she said. I prefer to think of myself as charming, attractive, and a world-class snogger. Shall I demonstrate? He asked, leaning in closer. Are you drunk? She asked, looking around as though ready to signal one of the aides. He smirked. Sadly, no. The truth was he'd drank one time only and hated it for a variety of reasons. The one he'd admit to was that it kept him from being in control. Never mind that it made him feel like rubbish. It would have been too easy to spill his secrets. Are you going to start drinking when you get out of rehab? Now we're really getting to some compelling questions. Am I going to drink when I get out of rehab? He tapped his finger on his lower lip. Claudia stared as though hypnotized. That depends. On what? She asked, writing down his answer. You'll find out. He swiped the papers that she'd signed and crossed the room to the exit. The aide leaped to his feet and tried to bar his way. Where do you think you're going, Wilde? The aide asked. I'll be taking my leave now, my good sir. He did a mock theatrical bow. I can't permit that. You're obligated to remain here for the rest of the show. Your little stunt didn't help matters. The aide crossed his arms. My management team would disagree. Don't you, love? He called to Claudia, gesturing she come over. For the aide's benefit, he pointed to the paper which terminated the contract with the rockers in rehab program. Alice or Claudia was not, in fact, his legal representation, but he'd deal with the repercussions of that later. Right then, he wanted nothing more than freedom and a breath of that fresh sea air. Come on, love. Let's go, he called to Claudia over his shoulder.
Chapter 5. Claudia. This is not what I had in mind when I asked if you wanted to go on a date, Claudia hissed. How had she not recognized that Hot Lips was none other than the rock star Wilde? Or when I requested to interview you. What did you have in mind? There was that irritatingly perfect smolder again. Wilde was agonizingly and antagonizingly flirtatious. She already hated the way it made her feel, out of control and starry-eyed. She was there for one reason only, to do her project and make Aunt Margot proud when she'd receive her diploma. What did I have in mind for the date? Actually, nothing. It was a dare at my job. That's why I gave you a fake name and number, she clarified. Ouch. He pressed his hand to his chest, mock hurt. I'm sure your inflated ego can handle it. They reached a reception desk and Wilde showed the paperwork to the woman. She gave him a shrewd appraisal over a pair of red eyeglasses. Claudia caught his full name written on the sheet. Carter Wilde Westcott. The lady with the red glasses typed into an ancient computer. The producers will not be happy, but hopefully we can get some peace around here. Everyone thought this would be a great opportunity, but this is a real rehab facility and the only rehabilitation this guy needs is. He cut her off. All right. I get it. I'm ready to go on with my life. Yeah, I bet, she said, passing him a clipboard. Just fill this out and you can be on your way. She turned to Claudia. I'm awfully sorry to hear about his grandmother. She shook her head sadly. Do you mean my aunt? Claudia started to ask. With a great flourish, he signed his name and elbowed her at the same time. Okay, Miss Von Plata, Mr. Wilde is officially discharged to you. I'll keep his family in my prayers. Nonetheless, she scowled as though glad to be rid of him. I didn't agree to. Claudia was suddenly afraid she was breaking the law despite signing with the fake name she'd given Carter at the restaurant. Further, she had no idea how the lady knew about Aunt Margot. You did. The woman with the red glasses tapped another piece of paper, suddenly serious. Claudia started to protest. The woman cut across her. Now. I know celebrity types can be dramatic, but save it until you get onto the other side of them doors. You are fully responsible for him. She pressed a button under the desk and a metal door buzzed. Good luck. When they passed through the doors, Carter hooped and spun around, pulling her close. Her entire body flared with that same shock of lightning as it had when they'd met at the restaurant. He took a deep breath by her neck, sending the tiny hairs aflutter. The lightning jolted her once more. Gardenia, he whispered. The thrill raced through her, but she shoved him away. Carter, what did that woman mean when she said that I'm responsible for you? Gardenia is my favorite scent. It's my perfume, but you're getting me off track. That was not the question that I asked. I feel like a new man. He reached for her hand. Their fingers brushed. For a split second, she considered letting him take it to ground her, but he was the source of the electrical charge. She wanted to feel it again yet wanted nothing to do with it. Having a hand to hold on to, someone to guide her through the tumult of her recent life was tempting, but he was not a candidate. Instead, she yanked her hand away and fished for her car keys in her purse. I feel like a very happy, sober man. Don't worry though. I was never drunk. Yeah. Right. That's what they all say. Then what were you doing in a rehab facility? She crossed her arms. The guy practically had a skip in his step. Then he halted and dashed down a nearby alley. Wait. What are you doing? Claudia asked, torn between being told she was in charge of him and needing to finish her interview, but not wanting anything to do with him because he was trouble. A small mob of people were crossing the street toward her. She froze as phones and cameras were raised. They were shouting. Wilde. That was him. Claudia chased after him. No way was she responsible for his erratic actions, but worry had crept into her mind and planted itself there. She signed a document and had no idea what it meant. Another, bigger worry followed. Was that what happened to Aunt Margot? Did someone have her sign something, transferring her funds? Claudia's footsteps felt heavy, but the Wilde fans were catching up, so she picked up her pace. Carter, she called as he zigged and zagged around cars in the parking lot. He looked over his shoulder and his eyes went wide. No one calls me that. You're running from a bunch of teenagers and housewives who want to take selfies with you. If you want to avoid that situation, I'll call you whatever I want. No more secrets or lies, Carter. I am not that kind of woman. I have an assignment to complete and, she may have been foolish signing what she thought was a typical non-disclosure agreement before reading it, but she wasn't going to let him get away with anything else. And the lady said I'm responsible for you. She grumbled. Fair enough. Where are you parked? She clicked the key fob of her aunt's Cadillac and they rushed to get in. Less than a minute later, they were cruising out of town. Nice wheels, Carter said, catching his breath. It's my aunt's car. I didn't need one in San Francisco. She practically swerved as she changed lanes. Wait another minute. What was the discharge lady saying about grandmother or aunt or whatever? The loophole was that there had to be an illness in the family and a member of my legal representation had to sign a paper to discharge me. They also have to look after me. His voice drew her gaze to his lips. He winked, and she snapped her attention back to the road. That was the only way I could get out of the contract. I've heard of some low-down things, but you should be ashamed of yourself. He leaned his head back on the seat. Every day I question my judgment, every day. The confession floated between them. Carter clapped his hand on her thigh and she suddenly accelerated before yanking his hand off her leg. A low sound of warning came from her throat. He lifted his hands in surrender and fiddled with the radio. She swatted his hand away, needing silence to focus. No way was she going to let a guy like him get under her skin. The radio played one of his songs before she turned it off. Should I be insulted? That was one of my favorites. It's a fine song. She did like the chorus and the little breakdown toward the end, but she wouldn't tell him that. I need to focus, to come up with a plan. Plans are for uptight bores, I usually prefer to be spontaneous. Clearly. Actually, I planned my escape right after you called for the interview. What's going to happen? Worry laced her voice. Nothing. Don't worry. You signed Alice, right? Well, yeah. He smirked. That's a girl. Now, no one will know. His leg jittered. Thank you for getting me off the show and then out of that tight spot. It's not that I don't want to give my fans photo ops and the like, but I'm not exactly on top of my game right now. I've been questioning a lot lately and just need some time. She knew the feeling, but couldn't help feeling aggravated. Is that because you're going through withdrawal and are jonesing for a drink? He raised his eyebrows. Have you been watching Rockers in Rehab because you have the lingo down? My aunt and I saw one episode. Margot had been entertained, but she'd dealt with plenty of guys like him in her day. Wilde was undeniably charismatic and magnetic, but underneath that, she saw a sadness she recognized. But he hid it well. Then again, so did she. Maybe that was why she hadn't left him on the side of the road. Was it the one when they got me back after escaping or the one when I kissed the counselor? She rolled her eyes. It was the one when you had a temper tantrum. That was not my shining moment, but viewers loved it. The thing is, what I said before about not being drunk, that was true. I flipped out because I realized I'd essentially agreed to stay locked up in a really posh jail for 30 days. She snorted. You don't believe me. I'm telling the truth. You just had me forge legal documents. I hardly believe that you're telling the truth. Those were just formalities and you signed willingly, the wrong name, I might add. Clever girl. I researched how to get out of the contract and there needed to be an illness in the family. You've mentioned. I was there voluntarily. This is strictly off the record, but Stage Wilde and the real May, Carter, his voice strained, are two different people. Sounds like you have a bigger problem than I realized. She pulled onto the shoulder of the road and stopped the car. Claudia lived in San Francisco and had faced her share of crazies. No way was she going to spend a second longer with him if that was the case. That's not what I mean. I got started in music pretty young. That's what people wanted in youth and hope. That doesn't last. So how to reinvent myself? How to revitalize my career? The people surrounding me, including my manager, agent, and publicists, advised in no uncertain terms that I win the West aka America where I wasn't as well known by embodying the British bad boy persona. For the last, well, almost 7 years, I've been pretending, acting, playing a role. Whatever you want to call it. I'm tired. It's not me. By the plaintive expression on his face, he may as well have lined up with Aunt Margot's dogs when they wanted a treat. Wow, Claudia said. She wasn't sure what to think. I have no idea why I just told you that. I've never told anyone. You cannot tell anyone. That is strictly off the record. And now I'm rambling. He fussed with a loose thread on his pants. No, thank you for telling me. Talking about things like that is helpful. She fought the urge to give his hand a reassuring squeeze. Now, L. Ryder? You've heard of him, right? He's the real deal. I'd like to be like him someday. He's just so purely himself. Carter hummed one of the famous musician's songs. Claudia turned to face the beautiful British man by her side. She met his gray eyes. They were honest, open, magnetic. She knew she was looking at Carter and not Wilde, the guy who'd answered every question with the word snog. She imagined herself sinking, dropping into those eyes like a pool filled with clouds. Carter, you should just be yourself, she said, breaking the spell. She signaled to get back on the road, but her heart tapped out a beat she didn't recognize. It was one she'd never felt before. Carter had a raw, childlike aspect to him at times, and at others, he was wild, untamed, but who was he really? Part of her wanted to know, and it had nothing to do with her assignment from Prince. What do I call you aside from my superhero, my knight in shining armor, my daring damsel, oh ye who rescued me from rockers in Rehab? Alice or Claudia Von Plata, was it? He asked with gusto. Who is this gorgeous woman? You said you go to school in California, but you're here. Why? I am Claudia Von Plata and am here taking care of my aunt because, perhaps there was something in the air that brought the truth to the surface, or maybe Carter's confession tempted her to give her own. Thankfully, she stopped herself in time she couldn't bear to put that particular truth into words. They were quiet until she pulled through the gate at the mansion in Blue Bay Beach. She drove there on autopilot, but wasn't sure what to do with Carter and needed to get back to check on her aunt. Swanky spot. How are we going to do this? Go on a date or go our separate ways, he asked. She sat there, unsure of how to answer. I have the assignment. So no date. What if I said it would rock your world? I'm a fun bloke. He got out of the car with a hint of disappointment, then quickly covered it up. She didn't budge. In that case, rock ya later. Just like that, he was as on it again, playing the role of bad boy that he'd described. She wanted to slap the smug look off his face. Yet, his eyes drew her in. They melted her defenses. She pulled the keys from the ignition and slammed the car door. She was no damsel. She was stronger than almost anyone knew. There will be no rocking. You, Carter, will not be rocking me. Pity. I just helped you out and I need to do this final project before I graduate with my degree. Will you please help me out? He sighed. I suppose so. But let's keep things quiet. I don't want to draw attention and see this nice little town swarmed. Right. Because you broke out of the rehab and found your way here for the second time. She tilted her head from side to side. He smiled a crooked smile. I found my way to you. Despite the humid Florida afternoon, his comment froze her to the spot. But ice didn't run through her veins. Instead, it was like the lightning had melted, leaving a lava-like feeling that flowed under her skin. She managed to show Carter inside and planted him in the sitting room with a bottle of water. I'll be right back. She hurried to check on her aunt who she found fast asleep. Claudia sighed. Aunt Margot was sleeping more and more often each day. Her aunt had worked with plenty of musicians, and Claudia was tempted to ask how to handle them, but she didn't want to burden her with her problems. As Claudia adjusted the overhead fan and made sure her aunt was comfortable, the faint strains of piano music filtered from below.
Chapter 6. Carter. Carter spotted the piano across the room like a magpie drawn to something shiny. The moment he laid his hands on the keys, he felt a sense of returning home. It was perfectly tuned and his fingers found the old familiar notes of classic songs by Bach and his favorite Clair de Lune by Debussy. A few minutes later he sensed Claudia standing in the doorway and let the piano fall silent. "You don't have to stop." That was beautiful. She seemed slightly more relaxed than when they'd arrived. "Care to join me?" He slid over on the bench and gestured she sit down. Claudia kept her distance. "I'm supposed to interview you. Get to know you. No better way than through our common language of music." She shook her head and gazed ahead like a scared animal caught in the headlights of a car. "In that case, I could go for another one of those pina coladas." He was hungry after the day's escapades. "What if people recognize you?" she asked. "Shall we go in costume?" "Are you into that?" he asked with a flirtatious smile. "It could be part of our date." A faint rose dusted her cheeks and she shifted uncomfortably. "Not interested?" "No, Carter." She gazed at her hands. "No, I'm not dating, just waiting." "Waiting?" he asked as naughty thoughts of her lips on his rushed through his mind. "Waiting for the one," she said softly. "Oh, the elusive one. Well, I suppose you just never know when he'll turn up. In the meantime, you and I can have a little fun, huh?" He extended his arm for her to take a seat. She slid into a nearby chair and set her notebook on her lap. "Okay, back to the questions. What does it feel like to perform live?" "Nothing like it." He went on to describe the thrill and rush of the stage. "But it's all play. All for the audience, the ratings, the sales." He felt an emptiness inside, a sudden ache in his chest. At least that's true for Wilde. "I don't know what it's like for Carter to perform. I don't know who I am anymore." He needed to figure that out. To find his muse. He glanced at Claudia jotting down her notes and a sudden longing sparked inside. She asked a few more questions, but the answers sent him down roads of self-inquiry. Maybe it was because there were no strings attached. She wasn't interested in him, his fame, or any of the trappings of his life. She was just a student with an assignment. He'd never been honest with someone before, or with himself, which could only mean one thing. Maybe she was something more. Claudia bit her lip and tapped the pen against her jaw. Her strong jaw. Her silky hair. Her soft skin. He wasn't above his desire to rock her world, but it was true, she wasn't that kind of woman. But what kind of woman was she? A gorgeous, intelligent, amazing woman. His pulse drummed in his chest and for the first time in memory, his fingers trembled as though he were nervous being around her. There was only one thing he knew that could steady him. "Actually, I think the best way to get to know me is right here." Again, he gestured she join him on the piano bench. "Let's play a song together." "I can't." "Pardon," he said as though he hadn't heard her correctly. "What was it that you said?" "Oh yes, you said, I started playing music when I was 3. On a metal bowl in the kitchen. I graduated to the piano in 3rd grade when the neighbor took me in. Then in 5th grade, I started on stringed instruments. Mastered every single one," he quoted. "Good memory. It helps to keep sharp for memorizing lyrics, music, that kind of thing." He set his fingers on the keys and started playing a jaunty show tune. She sat still as though somewhat stunned. He wasn't used to not getting a response, so he added some gusto, really threw himself into it, jostling around on the bench, and knocking his shoulder into hers, then going back to the bench. The corner of her lip lifted when he started singing nonsensical rhymes about a girl named Claudia who wouldn't let him play with the radio. "That doesn't rhyme. Do you know a better song? Because if so, it's all yours." He swept his hand across the keys. "We have to be quiet. I don't want to wake up my aunt. She's sleeping." "You mean she's already sleeping through this?" I can't help that it's loud. It's a piano. When I was younger and still lived with her, she never complained about when I'd play, but things have changed. Maybe she didn't mind because you're so talented. Come on, show me what you've got. I bet your aunt would love to hear. You don't know that I'm talented, she said pointedly. No. You're right. That's why you have to show me. She glanced toward the stairs. Carter didn't say more just then. When Claudia was signing him out of the rehab and he'd told the fib about an ill grandmother, she'd started to correct the aide by saying something about her aunt. Is your aunt sick? He asked gently. A shadow crossed her eyes. Not exactly. She used to say that age is just a number, but she's getting older. I bet she'd like to hear something beautiful. He nudged her. Yeah, she might. Claudia moved to the bench and planted her fingers on the keys. She sat for a moment, gazing at a painting of an angel on the wall as though she was scanning her memory for the songs her aunt loved, ones she had memorized, or as though she flipped through the sheet music that was filed away in her head. At last, the first notes of Pachelbel's canon in D resounded from the strings of the instrument. Carter leaned back, in awe of the clarity of her playing and the impeccable skill, but just when he expected the song to conclude, she continued playing a song he'd never heard before. It must have been original, but it was just as haunting and mesmerizing as pieces by the greatest composers in history. While they'd been sitting there, the sun had set, leaving the room murky and only lit by the landscape lighting shining through the large windows. When Claudia's fingers went still, he said, "No way could I follow that or join in. You're amazing." Tears filled her eyes. I shouldn't have done that. She got up as though she was going to rush away, but Carter gripped her arm. No, Claudia. That was a gift. That was real music, raw, from somewhere deep inside of you. Thank you for playing for me. She shook her head. No, it was too much. Too intense? He saw a reflection of part of himself in her then, it was in her eyes. Fear. Uncertainty. Old wounds. He wasn't sure it was the right thing, but it was the real thing. He drew her into a hug. Not the kind of hug that would surely lead to more, the kind Wilde would give. Instead, it was a Carter hug. One that he meant to offer her comfort, safety. Whatever just went on inside her mind, he'd hold a space for her to get it out or whatever she needed to do. She sniffled and pulled back, but he didn't want to let her go. I'm sorry. Sorry about all that. She wiped her eyes. I'm not. He'd needed a jolt of reality, of what had drawn him to music to begin with. It had been a sort of therapy, a place for him to channel all his pain after the accident. Over the years he'd lost track of how it had soothed him. Instead of pressing her, he said, Hey, how about the pina colada? I'm starved. They walked under the light of the rising moon to the Coconut Cove Café, where they'd first met. By then, Claudia had collected herself and was back to being her regular, if not somewhat prickly, self. It wasn't that she was uptight as he'd originally thought. Rather, she was guarded, but he'd seen a glimpse of what was underneath. He had a deep, overwhelming desire to help her let go of whatever bothered her so she could be truly and fully herself just like he wanted to. When they got to the restaurant, they took a table in the corner on the outside deck. A few tiki torches blazed and the faint lapping of the water on the pylons was audible over the oldies tunes playing from inside. You sure about this? She asked. I'd hate for fans to interrupt our meal. It wouldn't be the first time, but I give you permission to throw me over the rail if they swarm and I'll swim to safety. Claudia almost smiled. He could get used to seeing that expression on her lips. For a second, their softness and a little glint of shine from the gloss she wore entranced him. I'll gladly throw you overboard, she said with laughter in her voice. The comment hardly broke the spell, but he pulled himself loose and examined the menu. A woman with white hair approached the table. I thought you said he didn't call you back. Her hand was on her hip as though affronted. Betty, how did you know this was him, the guy you dared me to ask on a date? She arched her eyebrow and gave a knowing smile. Just so we're clear, she gave me a fake name and phone number, Carter added. If Billy gets to wear a fake ring, I figured I could give out fake info, Claudia said defensively. What matters is that you found each other after all. Betty smiled. Something like that, Claudia muttered. She went on to place her order. Carter followed up. Betty said, "I want the full story next shift, you hear?" At that, she marched away like a very small, but mighty drill sergeant. For the next hour, Claudia and Carter chatted, and it was nothing like an interview or an awkward first date. In fact, much like the music they'd both played earlier, the conversation flowed. They touched on her schooling, his career, but then when they veered toward family life, they both went quiet. Thankfully, the food arrived. When Betty brought the bill, she set it in front of him. Claudia went to grab it, but he was quick. She stared him down. "This is not a date." She cast the same sharp look at Betty. "We split the bill." The older woman held back a smile. "Tonight Billy makes her meals run to those less fortunate in our community, Mrs. Scaduto, who was recently widowed, the single mother on Gull Street, and many others. I thought your dining companion might like to make a donation. There's a card stapled to your bill explaining Coconut Cove special delivery. You can even round up to the nearest dollar if that's all you can spare. Every little bit helps." She tapped it on the table. "I'd be glad to." Carter pulled out his wallet and dropped $200 bills, which was significantly more than the bill total, including the tip. Betty's eyes widened. "Thank you. Don't mention it." "No, seriously, don't. I'd like to be anonymous for a few days if I can get away with it." Afterward, Carter and Claudia strolled slowly down the dock as though not sure what to say or where to go. Instead, they meandered along the beach. The moon and stars sparkled off the water. As they continued to chat, Carter reflected that somewhere along the shore, he'd left Wilde behind. He felt slightly nervous, but he took a risk and reached for her hand, wrapping his calloused fingers around hers. Her skin was soft, but her fingers were strong as she returned his grip. Those were the fingers that played the most moving song he'd ever heard, and yet she held onto something sorrowful. He wanted her to let it go, but didn't want to let her go when they reached the end of the beach and took the road back into town. The night was balmy and the frogs were croaking loudly. Ahead, he saw a sign for the Sandy Shore Inn. "I guess I should get a room." "You're not going home?" "You heard what I told Betty. I like it here." He wanted to add, "I like you too. Plus, home would require I get on an airplane and then you wouldn't be able to finish your assignment." She smiled like she was hoping to hear that. "Also, to be honest, I'm not sure where home is anymore. My career belongs to someone else, someone who is no longer the man I am." "Did this all just happen today?" she asked. He felt a wildness that was unlike his stage persona, a freedom that was lifting him up, giving him wings as he cast off the shackles of the person he'd been and the lie he'd lived. "No, Claudia. It's been a long time coming." He stepped closer, edging her out of the pool of the lantern light shining over them. He bit his lip, then met her eyes, bright in the dim light. He leaned in. She stepped back. Wilde wasn't a patient guy and was used to getting what he wanted when he wanted it. But Carter was different and was ready to give up the instant gratification lifestyle. If she wasn't ready to kiss him, he could wait. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a few more $100 bills and passed them to Claudia. Her face folded with disgust. "I am not that kind of." He cut her off before she said more. "I just want you to get me a room at the inn in your name. If anyone finds out I'm here, it'll be madness." "Oh, right." She shook her head as though she felt foolish for thinking he was suggesting something that a rock star with his reputation might about them and the hotel. He flashed a wild grin. "Unless you want to come with me." Maybe there was a little bit of the bad boy still in him. Mostly, he wanted to know if she heard the silent song that he sensed playing between them all night. She stammered. "Part of you does, huh?" "That was all I wanted to know." "What do you mean?" "I'm wondering if the feeling is mutual." "What feeling?" "I promised to rock you later." "I can wait for later." "I can wait as long as I have to." He winked. Her nostrils flared and she swept into the inn. Minutes later she emerged with a key and a stern expression. "If you so much as scratch a surface in there, stain the carpet, or I will be on my best behavior, promise." He bounced on his toes and nodded. "And why should I believe you? You completely wrecked the room at the Rehab center on the show." "I'd do it for you, Claudia." An affection and attraction unlike any he'd ever felt grew stronger the longer he spent with the woman with dark hair and eyes and a smile he tried to coax onto her lips at every opportunity. She exhaled, exasperated, and took off down the street. "See you in the morning," he called. She looked back and it took everything in him not to take off after her.
Chapter 7. Claudia. The whole thing had been one big, terrible mistake. Claudia shouldn't have reached out to the famous musician. She shouldn't have met with him, and she certainly should not have signed her name, okay, the fake name, Alice, without reading the content of the paper. As she laid in bed that night, she replayed the craziness of the day. But an image of Carter when she'd entered the room at the rehab facility hung in her mind. Sitting there, he looked so sad, so broken. She wanted to hold him in her arms even though it was against her better judgment. Bringing him back to Blue Bay Beach and getting him a room at the Sandy Shore Inn was the least sensible thing she'd done in ages, but she couldn't resist wanting to help him. There were moments during their time together when he was embodying the stage persona that he'd described. However, he hid pain under his lazy gaze. There were the wild moments when she caught him glancing at her and when he was sharing about his stage persona versus the real him, that he was thoughtful and genuine. When they were standing on the sidewalk by the inn, the lantern light highlighted his best features, his eyes, his strong jaw, and those lips that brought a longing to her own. Being around Carter and even thinking about him sent shivers through her that had nothing to do with the cold air conditioning. She got out of bed to adjust the thermostat and rubbed her arms as though trying to get rid of the thoughts of longing and possibility. Claudia was contained, self-possessed. She was in no position to date, despite Betty's dare. Not until she found the one. At least that was true until she sat down at the piano beside Carter and felt the music pass from him and into her, then move through her. She wasn't sure what came over her then as she'd transitioned from playing Pachelbel's canon to improvising with her own piece. She'd never played one of her originals in front of anyone. Even though she didn't want to admit it, there was a distinct possibility that Carter drew it out of her. She wasn't ready or interested in revisiting the past, which was what she did every time she played her own songs. As she padded down the hall, a familiar scent of cologne tingled her nose and set her nerves on fire. Maybe the past was revisiting her. Claudia's breath caught in her throat and her head suddenly ached. She leaned against the dark wallpaper as the room started to spin. The smell brought with it memories she'd tried to bury. At that, Claudia rushed to her aunt's room. Inside, she found Margot breathing softly, sound asleep. The mansion was otherwise still, silent. Claudia let out a long-held breath. It was probably just fatigue and stress. It had been a long day. After returning to her room, Claudia fell into a restless sleep, awash with dreams of wild getaways, the ocean, and Carter. The next morning, she got ready and went to work after leaving her aunt a fresh arrangement of flowers from the back garden and a note, because she was still resting. Claudia had the opening breakfast shift and sure enough, Carter was her first customer. He sat at the counter seat closest to the window. He wore a baseball cap and sunglasses that he must have picked up from Blue Bay Beach Supplies and Souvenirs, because the tag hung from the back strap. She plucked the price tag off and set it on the counter. "Now you only look slightly less like a tourist." "That's the idea," he said in his irresistible British accent. "You're hidden in here in the corner and half behind the soda machine. I doubt anyone would recognize you. You'd be surprised." He harumphed. "When are you done with your shift? What do you want to order?" I asked a question first. "I thought I was the one doing the interview." "Oh, right. You'd like a glimpse into my lifestyle, eating habits, and the like. When the camera isn't rolling, I'm afraid you'd get very bored. Anyway, remember what I was saying yesterday. Wilde is retiring." "Is that so?" "What about Carter?" she asked. "This is a new chapter in my life. I'm not sure what it's going to look like." Even though he wore sunglasses, she got the distinct sense he was looking right at her. Heat crept up her neck and she shifted from foot to foot. "What was it you wanted to order, Carter?" "I'll need a few more minutes with the menu, love." He was infuriating. Never mind that even when he spoke the simplest of words his voice was like velvet. Even hidden under his Blue Bay beach gear his handsome good looks were obvious by the cut of his jaw, the lushness of his lips, and the tilt of his smile. Even as Claudia hustled to keep up with the morning rush at the restaurant, having Carter Wilde Westcott sitting in the corner was a giant, distracting tease. She couldn't resist him. It was like he was a magnet and she was metal. "Did you decide what you'd like to order?" she asked after returning to him begrudgingly. He nibbled his bottom lip in a way that sent tingles shooting through her. What had happened overnight? The day before she had no trouble resisting him, for the most part. She staggered back. A dream she'd had the night before returned the way they sometimes did, randomly, jarringly. The dream had picked up where they'd left off by the sandy shore inn when he'd leaned in, when he'd said that he wondered whether the feeling was mutual. Only, in the dream, much like she had when she'd asked him on a date, she made the move. She leaned in and kissed him. Then she'd said yes, the feeling is mutual. It was right then, staring at the sea and with her order pad aloft, loose pieces of her hair in her face, and the morning rush of visitors and locals looking for breakfast that she was sure her dream was accurate. The feeling was quite mutual. Claudia liked, maybe more than liked, Carter. But she wasn't about to admit it. "I'll take the pina colada smoothie, please." He closed the menu. His charming, accented voice flooded her senses. He'd taken off the sunglasses and his gray eyes captured her sensibility. She was smitten, enamored, captivated. But it didn't make sense. They hardly knew each other. She didn't like Wilde. That was because she liked Carter, but who was to say he was honest, true, and would stick to his resolve about leaving his wild ways behind? As the morning wore on, Claudia goofed up several orders, sent a plate of ham and eggs to a customer who'd ordered pancakes, forgot to deliver waters, and was generally off her game. When the pina colada came up, she was glad to give him the drink and get him out of there. "A bit distracted today?" Isley asked with a wink. She'd certainly had her moments of distraction whenever Ford paid a visit to the restaurant, but when he brought cocoa, no one seemed to mind if she forgot a drink refill or flubbed something up because they all adored the little girl. Isley teased her a bit more, but Claudia deserved it. She was distracted as Carter remained in his seat reading the newspaper, doing a crossword puzzle and fooling around on his phone until her shift was over. He waited at the end of the dock. "Funny, meeting you here," she said. She wouldn't mind throwing him overboard right then. Her tips had been considerably lower that day, and since she couldn't find the money missing from her aunt's account, she was going to have to start liquidating Margot's assets to pay the bills, but in the meantime, they needed to live off her cash from the restaurant. "Funny meeting me here?" "Well, I haven't left." He stretched his arms overhead, revealing a slim bit of skin and remarkably defined abs. "Yeah, I know." She practically choked, once more distracted by him when in reality she had no time for that. She tried to talk herself out of it. She was just smitten by him, enamored, and infatuated with the tall, swarthy Brit along with every female between the ages of 14 and 80. Probably including Aunt Margot, which would put his demographic up toward women nearing their 90s. "So what do you want to do today?" "So far I've had the best morning I've had in a long time." He wore a lopsided grin that did not help her case. "How did that make for the best morning you'd had in a long time?" "You just sat there." "Exactly." I can't remember the last time I did nothing. No calls, no meetings, no interviews. Claudia sunk back. Does that mean our interview is off? No, it'll be my first one as Carter and possibly my last one. I want out of the limelight. But it's unofficial. I'm not going to tell the press or post it online or anything. It's just for my professor. Thank you. His smile was genuine. But what do you mean about it being your first or possibly your last interview? He shrugged. I'm going in a new direction. Where? I don't know. Does your management know? Absolutely not. This is all me, love. Again, that word in his dreamy voice sparked something inside Claudia. She checked her watch. I have to go, take care of my aunt. I can be helpful. No, let's meet later. Where? He asked that time. Claudia shrugged. How about dinner? He suggested. She tilted her head from side to side. I don't know. Carter squared his shoulders and faced her. Claudia, this isn't a dare or an initiation, but I'd like to have dinner with you. Will you go on a date with me tonight? A smile slowly bloomed on Claudia's lips despite her best efforts to resist it. Before she could stop herself, she answered, yes.
Chapter 8. Carter. Carter had asked Claudia, the most gorgeous, talented, and strong woman he'd ever met, on a date. A real date with the real him. His body jittered as he roamed around the quaint beach town, humming to himself. Being with her made him want to be better, to do better. Never had he felt such drive, such inspiration, or as alive as he did then. He found himself wandering down a palm-lined path that opened to a private cove. No one was around. The air was thick with the heat of midday. He tossed off his hat, sunglasses, shoes, and shirt, then plunged into the crystalline water. Closest to the shore it had been warm, but as he swam deeper it chilled, invigorating him. He whooped and the sound echoed across the blue sea, doubling back to him like a boomerang. Sitting in the restaurant with Claudia nearby and doing a whole lot of nothing was a nice way to begin the day. Then asking her on a date and rushing into the water punctuated it with a sense of perfection that he only imagined would get better when they went out to dinner that night. He'd learned that she'd lived in Blue Bay Beach for about a month, so likely it was still new to her. He'd have to figure out what they'd do. He thrust himself backward in the water and floated there, reviewing the mental map he'd made of the town so far. He could rent a boat and they could go for a cruise, though he'd need more cash for that, and the ATM at the local bank limited his withdrawals each day. He didn't want to use his credit cards because that risked being recognized and traced. As he pondered spending more time with Claudia, the sound of his phone ringing came from the shore. It split the peaceful silence. When it continued to ring, he trudged out of the water and stood for a few minutes to dry off before checking to see who'd called. He listened to the message, the third he'd received in as many days, about his sudden disappearance. There were a few texts that he'd missed reminding him about the Wild West tour starting in the fall. Carter dropped onto the sand. He was done with the act and realized he had been for a long time. But what troubled him the most was that by letting it go, he was forced to reflect on his brokenness and the circumstances that made him go along with the whole charade to begin with. It felt difficult, if not impossible, to face the past. After Carter returned to the inn to freshen up, he had a few hours before he was to pick up Claudia. He didn't have any instruments to fool around with, but he had an app on his phone that he could use to create music. It wasn't as good as the real thing, but sudden inspiration washed over him. He couldn't let it slip through his fingers. He'd been recording some song ideas on his phone too and was pleased with what he had come up with, inspired by the relaxed coastal town and the woman with brown hair and eyes who lived there. Later, he picked up an outfit from the boutique in town, luckily without being recognized. There was a moment when the salesgirl looked at him a second longer than was comfortable. He thought for sure that his cover was blown, but she simply bagged up the clothes and thanked him for stopping in. Wearing flip-flops with a pair of trousers and a button-down shirt, Carter walked down the sand-strewn street toward Claudia's aunt's mansion. At the gate, he was buzzed in. Claudia waited for him in the foyer with a shy smile. Her long hair was styled in loose curls and she wore a pair of jeans and a white knit sweater that reminded him of a fishing net. She looked beachy and stylish and downright beautiful. Without thinking, he leaned in to kiss her on the cheek by way of greeting. However, his lips barely brushed her soft skin when she pulled away. He wanted to get lost in her abundance of hair, in her floral gardenia scent. He thought maybe her aunt had appeared and would be disapproving, but it was just the two of them. Maybe she wasn't ready. Carter was patient. "So, where to?" she asked. "I was actually going to ask you as the resident expert." "Hardly an expert. Actually, Coconut Cove is the only proper restaurant in town." "Well, there's the snack shack down at the other end of the beach." "Do they serve milkshakes?" he asked, recalling her comment when she'd waited on him the first time. She nodded. "We're both wearing flip-flops. So when in Rome or Blue Bay Beach, shall we be beachy?" He extended his elbow. She linked her arm in his and she started toward the door. "I rather like the idea of us being casual. You know, no pressure for our first official date. But I'd feel rude if I didn't ask if I can meet your aunt. Actually, she's sleeping." Claudia gazed toward the grand staircase. "She's been sleeping more often than not lately." Worry laced her tone. "We don't have to be gone long or you can always call to check on her." She nodded, and they left on foot. The snack shack was a retro, quintessentially American burger and fries place. They also served onion rings for an extra few dollars. The highlight was the 24 different kinds of milkshakes. After eating, they each sipped, or rather, slurped, their frozen desserts. "Want to try the mint chocolate?" he asked, angling his cup toward her. She passed him her peanut butter banana drink while taking a sip of his. Delicious." She closed her eyes. "I hope you don't have milkshake regret because if you do, you can finish it." "Thanks. But I've always been a peanut butter anything kind of girl." "Tell me more about what kind of girl you are." "Favorite color, book, movie," he said, echoing her inquiry. "I thought I was the one who was supposed to do the interviewing." "This is a date, remember?" They walked down the beach and swapped all the favorites they could think of: candies, vacation spots, movies, actors, songs, bands, and more. Claudia shivered as she took the last sip of her milkshake. Carter extended his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. At first, she felt stiff, resistant, but he wouldn't give up unless she asked him to. He sensed she was fighting with herself over whether to trust him. They took a few more steps, and she soon melted against him. He wanted to stay like that, by the seashore in the sleepy little town where no one but her knew him, but she prompted them to continue on. Soon, they were on Mansion Mile and she entered the password on the keypad to her home. He lingered there, wanting to kiss her goodnight, but she was already passing through the wrought iron gate. He lifted his hand to wave goodbye. "Come on," she called. With a lift to his step, he followed her to the mansion. She got them both glasses of water. Then leaving him in the sitting room again, she went to check on her aunt. When she returned, she went to the piano and sat on the bench. Without a word, she played one of Mozart's sonatas. When she neared the end, he joined her on the bench and led the duet for Sonata in D major. It was like they could communicate without words, just sound. They were harmonious, perfectly in sync as they moved up and down the keys. Carter nearly made a mistake and threw his head back in laughter, but they carried on. During a complicated part, their eyes locked as though spurring each other on before returning their focus to the ivory keys. Carter hadn't played classical music in a long time, but it came back to him like riding a bicycle. What he wasn't entirely familiar with was the deep welling of emotion that came over him when he was with Claudia. It brought him joy, made him feel alive, and he didn't want the song to end. So instead of letting the keys ring out, he shifted into the retro song Rock Around the Clock. She joined right in and soon they were both laughing and singing along. By the time that song was done, his fingers were stiff, but they found hers. She beamed a smile. A deep, resonant humming came from inside of him and warmed him through. Not leaving the bench, but turning to face each other, they chatted for a few minutes about the pieces of music. She then told a few stories about school at the conservatory in San Francisco. Although she was classically trained, they both understood the universal love for combining notes and vibrations to make sound and song. They understood each other and they were close, so close. Carter played with a loose piece of Claudia's hair. Music and performing live is like traveling to the moon, except it takes away the gravity of thought and there is sound, the taste of air ripping through my lungs, the scent of sweat and effort, connection, and so much movement. It's the suspension of my mind. It is freedom. She paused a beat as though thinking. What are you trying to break free from? She asked. The past. Me too. She wore a sad, resigned expression that pulled at the corners of her mouth. I'll tell you if you tell me. If you want to. She shifted as though conflicted, then cleared her throat. Before I turned 10, life was tough. My father was violent and left us. She twisted the watch on her wrist. My mother was an alcoholic and had diabetes, which is really dangerous. And your aunt? She rescued me. She believed in me. She adopted me. I'm sorry you ever had to go through that. I've never told anyone. No one, he asked, shocked. She shook her head. Does the watch have anything to do with your mother or father? He noticed she fiddled with it whenever she was uncertain. She lifted her eyes to meet his as though surprised he made the connection. It was my father's. I wear it as a reminder that at any time either one of them could come back and make my life miserable again. The fact that she lived with that kind of fear caused his chest to ache and his jaw to tense. And that helps you how? The question came out rough, but all he wanted to do was free her from that kind of agony. It keeps me on my toes and reminds me to be grateful for each passing day that I am free. You're an adult. You're free if you want to be. Your father can't come back and cause you trouble. She studied the hands on the watch. Do you know where he or your mother are now? Claudia sniffled. I'm not sure. My father was in jail for a time, but they may have sent him back to Montreal. He and my aunt are originally from Canada. Carter reached out for Claudia. He wanted nothing more than to relieve her of the burden and protect her from the people she imagined might return to her life and harm her. Before long, she squared herself in front of the piano and laid her fingers on the keys and started playing her heart out. He watched her expression flicker through the layers of pain she tried to keep at bay. Sadness filled her brown eyes, but beneath that, he recognized a glimmer of hope. It was the same one that he'd all but abandoned but found a sliver of back in the church in town. It fueled him, that gave sound to his feelings and that reminded him that even on the cloudiest of nights, the stars still twinkled in the distant sky. In the following weeks, time dispensed itself rather quickly. They were the kinds of days Carter wanted to be slow but sped by, unlike the many days he counted in his past that he'd rather have over quickly but tended to creep along. But during that time, Carter and Claudia got to know each other. One date turned into 2, then 4. He spoke to his team and made it clear he was taking a break. They didn't respond well. But what choice did they have? He wouldn't tell them where he was, and he was sure that they didn't expect to find him where he'd escaped when he'd first fled the rehab facility. The small town had become a sanctuary. If anyone recognized him, they kept it to themselves. For that, he was grateful. Each night, Claudia and Carter got together to play music. After they finished a modern piece by a Japanese pianist, he asked after her aunt because he still hadn't met her. I brought her for a checkup yesterday, and she's healthy. They just said she's tired. Common at this age. I think she hears us playing though. It's probably the soundtrack to happy dreams. Claudia's chin trembled as she tried to smile. How could she not, he said with a chuckle. I'm happiest when playing. Me too. I feel most like myself. Me too. He nodded. And when I'm with you. Seated on the wooden piano bench, they were close. Close enough to kiss. Her lips were 2 perfect pillows that she'd painted with gloss earlier but had since faded. He inhaled the faint scent of vanilla along with her gardenia perfume. But we're doing this all backward, Claudia whispered as though his comment caught up with her. Trepidation laced her voice. Maybe we are doing it backward, but I've never done anything forwards or sidewards. I say, onward. Let's see what happens. His voice was thick with longing. At that, their lips crashed together. He was gone, swept away by her, yet still very much in his body as it hummed and heated up. The room was otherwise silent, just the 2 of them, making their own music. They moved in harmony, each seeking the other with their lips. His hands tangled in her long hair and hers pressed against the firm muscles of his back. As they continued to kiss, his chest swelled like the crescendo of a masterpiece in the making.
Chapter 9. Claudia. The last days and weeks had been leading to the moment Carter and Claudia shared. It was fitting that they were seated on the piano bench. It was through music she felt like she was most honest and able to translate into sound the pain she couldn't put into words. With each note, she felt as though she were letting a piece of the past go, and with each passing minute with Carter, it was as though she were inviting in her future. She'd told him about her past, but the more they played music together, the more she was able to put it behind her, to let the possibility for goodness into her life. Goodness she secretly wanted to share with him. The stubble along Carter's jaw scratched her cheek as he moved from kissing her lips to planting 100 tiny kisses behind her ear, and down the side of her neck before their eyes met. They searched hers as though trying to find the right chord for a nameless tune, one they were writing together. His hand skimmed her cheek, and she felt a tremulousness in her lips because she wanted more of Carter, but knew something was bound to interfere if she let herself get too happy or feel too free. It always did. But he pinned her with a reassuring gaze, not allowing her thoughts to chatter with dark notes of fear and loss and anxiety. Then his lips softly locked on hers again, and it was that second kiss, which was tender, that proved Carter wasn't the British bad boy he'd made himself out to be. It bridged the first, which had told her how very much he wanted her, with a fierce hunger that had been building between them. The lift and fall of their chests fell into synchronicity as they each remembered that breathing, and not kissing, was a requirement. It was almost a melody as the kiss deepened. There was a third part to the particular tune of the kiss, and it was when they pulled apart, she was left wanting more. Feeling as though her lips were swollen and pink, she got them each a glass of water. Her legs trembled and she absent-mindedly brought her hand to her mouth, feeling the slight sting like she'd been in the sun all day. She fanned herself, still heated from Carter's kiss. His energy was enough to illuminate an entire planet, and she wondered what it would mean if they were to be together. What about his career? Her aunt and future? She still had a few more leads to follow before she put the house up for sale, but she wasn't ready to give up. At that, the notion of other people, namely Carter, giving up on her threatened to ruin the evening. Her parents had abandoned her. What was to stop some guy she'd only known for a few weeks from deciding he was through with her? His melodic voice interrupted the jumble in her mind and set her to rights. "What's the plan?" he asked. She swept her hand across her forehead, then opened the back door leading to the slate patio and pool below. "Let's live on the wild side. Let's not have a plan. Let's be spontaneous, see what happens. It's warm out tonight, but you really heated me up in there," he practically growled, catching up to her from behind and wrapping his arms around her waist. A smile rose to her lips as he kissed her cheek. "You said you wanted to be spontaneous. You know what that means." He glanced over her shoulder before scooping her up and rushing down the steps toward the pool. She wore a t-shirt and cut-off jeans, but before she could take off her watch, Carter tossed her in the pool. He dove in as she surfaced, whooping. She swam over to him, unsure whether to be annoyed, the old Claudia, or relish in the joy they brought each other, the new Claudia. She didn't know Wilde as well as she did Carter, but she couldn't find it in herself to be upset with him for tossing her in the water. It was her idea to be spontaneous after all. They faced each other, treading water. A drop dripped from his nose, and without thinking she gave it a kiss, which turned into another on his temple, then one more on his chin. She explored the very kissable areas on his face before his lips found hers. They kissed again in the cool blue light of the pool. At last, they pulled apart and then lifted onto the tiled edge. "That was supposed to cool us off?" Carter asked. "I feel a bit refreshed." She smiled. His eyes landed on her wrist. I'm sorry. I forgot to have you remove all valuables. Her gaze followed his and she unclasped the watch. It's okay. I think this has been weighing me down anyway. She tossed it into the darkness toward a nearby chair. Then gripping his shoulders, she dunked them both back in the pool. They splashed around for a few minutes, laughing and kissing each other intermittently. It felt wonderful, playful, free. He wasn't what she'd expected at all. He was more. She tilted her head back in the water, thanking her lucky stars that they'd found each other, then laughed to herself because that was a very un-Claudia thing to do. Then again, so was falling in love and swimming in a pool at night. Claudia abruptly went still when she suddenly smelled a sharp scent of cheap cologne. Are you okay? Concern furrowed Carter's brow at the sudden change. I'm fine. Sorry. I thought. She shook her head and then picked up her smile and laughter where she'd left off. She wanted to be free of the past. We should dry off anyway, Carter said, helping her out of the pool. She went to an outdoor cabinet to grab some towels, and when she passed the chair where she thought she'd thrown the watch, it was gone. It must have fallen into the shrubbery. She'd look in the morning when it was light outside. After saying good night to Carter, Claudia showered and got into bed. She tried to bask in the memory of them kissing, of how it lit her up inside, and how they'd attuned to each other, especially when playing music on the piano, but she couldn't help but dwell on the old, familiar smell of cologne and how the watch had gone missing. Louis was never far from her mind, especially since arriving at her aunt's house, but he was the last person she wanted to think about. The next morning, after having breakfast with her aunt, Claudia went outside to find the watch. She searched on the pool deck and even checked the filters. She distinctly remembered tossing it on a chair, but it was nowhere to be found. She sought out Esmeralda, the housekeeper, but she hadn't seen it either. Afterward, Claudia went to her aunt's home office to finish going through files, scanning documents, and digging around on the computer accounts to figure out where 7 figures might have vanished to. Her phone beeped with Tutti Frutti, the song she had programmed for her aunt's number. Hello, but she asked, suddenly worried Aunt Margot had fallen again and was stuck upstairs. It had only been about an hour since she'd checked. At the sound of the caller's greeting in French, she swept from the office and hurried upstairs. When she entered the room, the older woman was sleeping sweetly in bed. Who is this? Claudia hissed as she closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway. Louis. Remember me? He asked in French. Of course, I remember you. Why do you have Aunt Margot's phone? How'd you take it from her? She spun around, suddenly worried he was in the house. Had he been? Did he find the watch? She raced to the security system panel to make sure it was armed. I need something from you, he said. Don't count on me giving you a thing, Claudia spat. I know about your little playdate with a certain famous rock star who's trying to keep his presence in your quaint little town quiet. Have you been watching me? Knots tightened in Claudia's stomach and a cold sweat coated her skin. There are a few passwords that I need you to get, s'il vous plaît. What do you mean? Claudia made a sudden and startling realization. You didn't only take her phone, you took her money. The cold sweat turned into red-hot anger. She hardly knows who she is, never mind what she has. Mockery spiked Louis's tone. That is wrong. Why would you do such a thing? Find out her password for the Allied financial account, fee. I will do no such thing. Remember what I said about your rock star boyfriend. The clock is ticking. You took the watch. Well, it was mine, but I'm sure you can still find out the time, and trust me, you don't have much. Claudia had about 10 more questions to ask him and at least twice that number of things to say to him. She seethed. There was no way she'd give him anything other than her disdain. But she had to figure out a plan. When she reached Aunt Margot's room, the older woman was awake and bright-eyed. Claudia tried to release the tension in her shoulders. "Are you okay, darling? I heard you on the phone. You sounded upset." She didn't want to trouble her aunt, but she wasn't going to dance around the truth. "Aunt Margot, have you seen Louis lately?" She held the older woman's eyes, hoping this was a lucid moment. "Heavens no. Last I heard he was in jail. Good thing too. I wouldn't trust him not to rob me blind." "This is hard to say, Aunt Margot, but I think he has been doing just that." Confusion flickered across her features and Claudia feared she was losing her presence of mind. "Oh, I doubt that, darling." As quickly and clearly as she could, Claudia explained the phone call and the missing money. Margot waved her hand dismissively. "This is nonsense. Remember how when you went to the hospital, we found out that your insurance premium hadn't been paid? Well, he said he was going to take care of it." Claudia jolted. "I thought you said you hadn't seen him." The knots in her stomach twisted around each other. "He missed me. I only had one brother. I remember taking care of him when he was little. Such an ornery little bugger." She smiled fondly as though she'd forgotten all the trouble he'd caused over the years. "Aunt Margot. Please, tell me, have you seen him? Did you leave him in charge of your finances?" "I'd just as soon leave him in charge as I would Bella, Bear, and Lulu." Claudia's eyebrows pinched together. "Remember I told you he took your phone and called me, asking to find out the password for your Allied financial account? That means he's been here. The dogs would do a better job of protecting my wealth than that old trout." Margot leaned back on her pillow as the effort and confusion took her under. She soon went back to sleep. Claudia felt frustration welling inside, but her aunt couldn't help it. She kissed her on the forehead and swept from the room. She gathered up everything she'd discovered about her aunt's finances, which wasn't much, and called the police. After reporting Louis and the suspected case of elder abuse in the form of financial exploitation, Claudia was left feeling helpless, frustrated, and unable to sleep.
Chapter 10. Carter. The next day, Carter went to the Coconut Cove Café for what was quickly becoming his daily dose of the pina colada smoothie, and Claudia. He'd never before paid much attention to what he'd eaten or drank, but being in the small town with all of its outdoor activities, the fresh sea air, and the sunshine, he felt like a new man. One who cared about himself, his health and mindset when before he'd lived the rock and roll lifestyle. He also cared about Claudia. He entered the dining room with its thatched roof, the consistent scent of coconut mixed with the breeze coming off the ocean, an oldies music soundtrack. The Four Tops, Bobby Darin, and of course, Elvis were quickly becoming favorites, which could have been because they so often sang about love. His eyes landed on a tall woman with dark brown hair, pulled up into a ponytail, long legs, and the most tempting smile he'd ever seen. The song Why Do Fools Fall in Love bopped from the stereo system. Carter would be a fool not to love her. He did love her. With a delighted sigh, he sat in his usual spot at the end of the counter. He hadn't seen that coming. Sure, he was a flirt, but never before had he felt such a solid, sure feeling. It surged in his chest and pressed against his ribs as though it might burst from him in a loud proclamation. A tune that wasn't the same as the one playing over the speakers entered his mind, followed by a few lyrics. He grabbed a napkin and started penning them down, overcome with affection, inspiration, and certainty that Claudia was the woman for him. The other waitresses greeted him, but they left his order for Claudia to take. She was busy, hustling from table to table. She had to take care of her aunt, and although she seemed to like her job at the cafe, he wanted to take care of her. With the tour coming up in the fall, he wasn't sure how to go about cancelling or how to handle everything, but he'd figure out a way. It took Claudia a while finally to break free and greet him. When she did, her eyes were clouded over and dark rings colored the space beneath them as though she hadn't slept much the night before. He hadn't either, but it was because he couldn't stop thinking about her. However, she looked worried, concerned, whereas he'd felt jubilant. Good morning. Had she not been on the other side of the counter, he would have given her a good morning kiss. Hey, she said slowly. Something thick and slippery worked its way between them as she stood there. Is everything okay? He asked. Yeah. She pasted on a smile. It was different from the one that usually tripped his pulse. What can I get you? She asked. It was as if the music went off. Had it been a record, it would have scratched and all he would have heard was static. Oh, I guess I'll have the pina colada smoothie. She stood there a minute longer, jotting his usual order down. Her eyes darted over him, then just as quickly she rushed off to the cook's window. The awkwardness he sensed slithered into his belly, making his insides feel all wrong. He suddenly wasn't hungry for breakfast. He watched her carefully without being obvious about it. What had changed overnight? Carter, Wilde, wasn't used to women denying interest in him, but a sudden and upsetting thought flooded his mind. Maybe she had a boyfriend back in San Francisco? He'd never bothered to ask because that wasn't something Wilde ever cared about. He sunk further onto the stool. Eventually, she brought his smoothie over. It brimmed with a striped straw, umbrella, and tiki decorations. Is there anything else you need? She asked. Yeah. He needed to know what was bothering her, but the cook called her name from the window to run another order to a table. I'm all set, I guess. His mind was a jumble and the right words to ask what was going on didn't form quickly enough. Carter didn't feel like drinking the smoothie with all its colorful, happy flair, but he did. When he got up to pay, Claudia neared the door. She wasn't wearing her apron. He threw a large bill on the counter and rushed after her as she exited the restaurant. She moved fast and was already on the dock when he caught up. He reached for her arm. You seem different today. What's going on? Did we move too fast? No, I just have to leave work early today. Listen, if I overstepped last night. Not everything is about you, Carter. She shrugged her arm free. He leaned back. Oh. I just thought. She started walking again, and he strode by her side. Claudia, I don't understand. If it's not about us, what happened? Is your aunt okay? At that, she stiffened and her lips parted. I just have an appointment. Everything is fine. Let me come with you. She bustled away, but he followed her all the way to her aunt's car, which she'd parked across town, even though it was just as fast to walk to the mansion. She leaned against the door before opening it. Her eyes were wide as though she were ready to take flight. Please, Claudia. Tell me what's upsetting you. The pleading in his voice sounded foreign to his ears, but he couldn't bear to see her distressed. Let me help you fix it. It's a family thing. You wouldn't understand. She clicked to unlock the car. He rushed over and got in the passenger seat before she could lock him out even more. Try me. She had no idea what he'd been through with his family. You don't know anything about real life. You're rich and famous and have everything you could want. He shook his head. That wasn't true. Not at all. She'd started the car and her hands shook. She gripped the wheel tightly. I'll drop you off at the inn. No, I'm going with you. Clearly, you're upset. Maybe even spooked. I don't know, but wherever you're going, I want to go with you. She sighed, and it was a full 5 minutes before she spoke. They were on the long double-lane road out of town that led to the nearest city. My aunt's brother is trouble. He's caused more problems than he's worth. I left San Francisco to take care of her, but also learned that her money was gone and her bills unpaid. Claudia went on to describe her aunt's health and wealth and how both were failing. Foolishly, her brother was the last person I suspected because I thought he was well out of our lives. But he turned up and wants more money. He wants a password to one of her accounts, Claudia said. Did you call the police? Yes, but I was told it might take weeks before they are able to take on the case because it's a low priority. So you decided to take matters into your own hands, he asked carefully. She set her jaw and nodded. Carter wiped his brow, grateful he'd insisted on going with her. So your aunt's brother just wants money? Yeah. I assumed my aunt only had one account, because, well, I only have one bank account. But she was smart and diversified all of her assets. Louis was quicker than me to realize this, and after draining account number 1, he's now moved on to number 2. How many are there? After going through her files again last night, I think just 3, plus various other holdings and real estate, but still. He blew through a lot of money. Claudia wiped her eyes. And Aunt Margot doesn't even realize it. So what's the plan? He asked me to give him the passwords. Is he dangerous? Couldn't you have simply texted him some fake info? He eyed her, trying to make a joke about how she'd given him a fake name and number. I figured if I could talk to him, then maybe I could get him to leave us alone. From the sound of the guy, that wasn't going to happen. Do you know the password to the account? When I asked Aunt Margot, she just started talking about the dogs, nonsense mostly. She's not herself. Comes and goes. The nurse said it's common at her age. The sun was high in the sky and the air was warmer inland as Claudia pulled into a parking lot in front of a coffee shop. Good thinking to go somewhere public, but I'm glad I came with you. Claudia just stared ahead as though trying to convince herself she could go through with it. Carter gave her hand an encouraging squeeze even though he wasn't convinced it was the best course of action. They entered the quiet coffee shop and Carter couldn't help but compare it to the lively Coconut Cove Café with its oldies music. He figured Betty was behind that because sometimes when she wasn't there Billy put on tiki or reggae music. He was glad for the break from Wilde's tunes. Claudia surveyed the room, then went to a table in the back. They sat next to each other, and she was shaking. He reached under the table and gripped her hand. After a few minutes, a heavy-set man wearing a suit approached and stood over the table. He eyed Carter, then spoke in rapid French. "Can we just talk?" Claudia said. "I was talking. Don't you have a hug for your father?" He opened his arms. "No, I don't," she said flatly. "That hurts, Claudia," Louis said. "So, who do we have here?" The older man gave Carter a sidelong glance. "This is my friend." He ignored how it hurt that she didn't mention Louis, her aunt's brother, was actually her father, and how she didn't introduce Carter as her boyfriend. Louis appraised Carter from under bushy eyebrows. The man was easily in his 60s, but was tall and in his own way, still formidable. Carter imagined him wearing a fedora and playing the role of a mobster in an old movie. "You look familiar," Louis said. "Do I know this guy?" he asked Claudia. He knew when someone had identified him by the certainty in their eyes, but Louis was playing it cool. Claudia inclined her head, then shook it. "Listen, I want you to leave Margot alone. Whatever you've been doing, stop. She's not in any state to. It's tough seeing her get so old, but where she's going, she doesn't need her money. She always took care of me, so I figure, why stop?" He let out a dry laugh. "Because you're a leech," Claudia ground out. Carter wasn't sure of the sordid details of the family's past, but Claudia's worry seemed to turn into anger. Whatever was going on was probably illegal, and if the police weren't going to get involved right away, he understood why she took matters into her own hands. But so would he. He slid his hand into his pocket and clicked the record button on his phone. Father and daughter were going back and forth about Margot and him sneaking into the house when Louis suddenly stopped. "Hey, I do know you. You're that rock star. Wilder? That song about that blazing star is pretty good." He smirked. He was referring to Falling Star, one of his hits, but Carter didn't acknowledge it. "I bet I could get a nice sum if I call and tell the paparazzi where you're hiding out. Claudia, you could give an exclusive interview and make some fast cash." "I don't cheat people like you do, Louis. I prefer to think of it as leveraging my connections." Louis' smile was greasy, slimy. "Where have you been?" she asked. "Here and there." "Is there jail?" "Made some good friends in the joint and learned some computer skills." He winked. "Tapping into accounts isn't impossible. If you don't give me the passwords, I'll find a way." Louis' voice was like sandpaper in Carter's ears. Hopefully, his phone was picking up everything the guy was saying. "If you were hoping to have a nice little family reunion, Phil, surely you know me better than that." Claudia wiped her eyes quickly as though she wouldn't spare a tear for the man who called himself her father and stole from his family. No, I wanted to tell you to leave Margot alone. Or what? Louis asked with a threatening edge to his voice. Carter had heard enough. He stood up. Or me. You? When I was your age, I took down guys like you for breakfast, Louis snarled. Carter leaned in, filled with a protective sense of rage. Cheap cologne bit his nose and he fought a sneeze. You're no longer my age. Louis was still a large man, but where he once may have been muscular, he was doughy. Carter was hardly intimidated. Do you want to take this outside, music man? Louis asked. It would be my pleasure. What had started as a warm concern for Claudia turned into boiling anger as he prepared to take the liar and thief down.
Chapter 11. Claudia. Carter stalked out of the coffee shop and Claudia caught up to him as he neared the door and gripped his arm, stopping him. You don't have to do this. I know I don't. I certainly don't want to, but that guy is a creep. I'm not going to let you take any of this lying down. I'll make sure he stays away from you. He rushed away. She followed, desperate not to let anything get out of hand. She knew Carter was tough, but she'd seen Louis take bigger men down. Then again, he'd plumped up quite a bit since she'd last seen him, which was at least 15 years previous. Carter stood in the middle of the parking lot, looking around. Louis was nowhere to be seen. Where'd he go? Carter's chest heaved as though he was ready to fight. His fists were drawn tight. She placed her hand on his arm. Figures. He took off. It's not the first time. That's more his style, to disappear. Carter took a few deep breaths through his nose and paced a small circle. Why didn't you tell me that Louis was your father? Because he lost that role a long time ago. What about your mother? Claudia went on to tell him that her mother and father were never really in love. When they had her, her mother wanted to give her up for adoption. To his credit, Louis disagreed and for long periods of time, he left her with Margot. They were siblings, but almost 20 years apart. She ended up taking care of me and eventually adopted me. I'm sorry, love. Carter wrapped his arms around her. She closed her eyes as he held her and the word love echoed in her ears. It was like how Aunt Margot called her darling. It didn't mean anything. Because anyone who was ever supposed to love her, cheated, left, or both. Louis was a jerk, but he was right. Aunt Margot would be leaving soon. If she let herself get too close, Carter would as well. After all, he had a tour in the fall and wherever else his rock and roll lifestyle took him. Undoubtedly, that would mean far from her. She got in the car, still feeling shaky, so she tuned the radio to a rock station, which happened to be playing one of Wilde's songs. He turned it off. Wait. Let's listen to this. He pulled out his phone. For the next few minutes, she relived the meeting with Louis as he essentially confessed to everything. The recording wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Wow. That was good thinking, Claudia said, grateful he'd had the presence of mind to record the conversation on his phone. I've been using this feature of my phone a lot lately. Carter's lips quirked. I figured it was good for more than writing love songs. He tapped to send a copy to her phone. Feeling a sense of relief that she had some evidence to give to the police, she maneuvered out of the parking lot at the coffee shop and back to the long road to Blue Bay Beach. Claudia went directly to the mansion, eager to check on her aunt to make sure she was okay. She'd already changed all the passcodes for the house's security system and cancelled Aunt Margot's mobile service, but mostly she worried about her aunt being alone and afraid, much how she was feeling, despite Carter's help. Aunt Margot was asleep. As she started to slip quietly out of the room so she didn't wake her, she paused, noticing for the first time in weeks that Margot looked even older and frilier, like one day she might not wake up. Claudia knew it was coming and wiped away her tears. Downstairs, Carter was seated on the piano bench and gazing out the window. He turned and smiled when she neared. She'd miss him too. He got to his feet and rubbed her upper arms. "You've had quite a day. You know what always makes me feel better?" He guided her to the seat and sat down beside her. As her fingers landed gently on the piano keys, the tension dissolved. The worries and chatter in her mind went quiet. She started to play, not a piece with sheet music or anything anyone had ever heard, but what came from deep within. It was intense at times as she channeled her emotions into the moody song, but when the piano went silent, she could breathe again. "When I was little and upset, my mother would bring me to the piano and say, 'Let it out, let it all out.'" Carter played a melody that was livelier than her dirge. "Claudia, I don't think you've let it all out. I understand that you're channeling more than sound. You're trying to make sense of the past when you play the piano." She gazed at her hands. "I've never met anyone who understood that." He brought two of his fingers to her chin to lift it so she'd meet his eyes. She wanted to look away from the intensity in those gray pools that said as much about the truth as did his perfect lips. But she knew better than to trust any of it. "You've never mentioned much about your parents," she said, changing the subject. His chest lifted and fell with a deep breath. "Mum and Dad were amazing. I couldn't have asked for better parents. They were supportive, kind, compassionate. My mother loved Elvis. My dad was more of a Beatles guy. They were everything." Carter's gray eyes misted over. His hands landed on the piano keys and he played a song that matched hers in intensity. When he was done, he said, "See. I understand." "What happened to them?" she braved asking. "They died in a car accident, a drunk driver. It was the day after my 11th birthday. They'd gotten me a guitar. I smashed the thing, then it took me 3 months to put it back together. It's never left my side until now." Since being in Blue Bay Beach, Carter had gotten tan and he was so close Claudia could count his freckles. His eyes dipped, then his lips landed softly on hers. A flare of longing rushed through her, but she jolted back. He circled his arms around her waist as though sensing her retreat. "The last weeks with you are like nothing I've ever experienced. When we're not together, I crave you, Claudia. I'm not a drug. I was never on drugs or alcohol. I think you understand why. It was all for show. The big show, the charade." "But how do I know what's real with you?" she asked. He flinched. "I thought," he stammered. "I thought I was showing you that. Maybe I need to hear it." She struggled internally. She didn't want to push him away, but she had to before things went too far. He nodded. "Yeah. Maybe you do. Maybe you also need to hear the truth." His accented voice turned sharp. "Maybe it's time you get real with yourself, Claudia. You try to keep all the pain from your past tidy and organized. Let it flow through you, out your fingertips and into the keys. Then let it go." "Oh, and you're the expert?" "I'm not an expert and I'm not perfect, but I've given up on Wilde, the whole British bad boy persona. I'm just being myself. I'm sorry if that's not enough." She shook her head and got up from the piano bench. "This is too much. I have to go back to San Francisco at some point and you have the tour in the fall. This is just a summer fling or whatever." Tension formed between Carter's eyebrows and went all the way to his shoulders. He opened his mouth as though to defend himself. Claudia cut across him. "It's been fun, I'll admit that. But I let everything happen with Louis because I haven't been with my aunt enough. I let it all happen because you distracted me. Carter crossed the room to where she stood. You can't blame yourself. You have been taking care of your aunt. Louis would have caused that trouble no matter what. Can't you give us a chance, Claudia? The flares of longing and loathing fought inside Claudia. She wanted to be with Carter but hated herself for letting anything come between what little family she had. It would be hard, but she had to do what was right and cut things off with him before their relationship took her away from what was most important, protecting her aunt and her own heart. You're not used to hearing no, Carter, but I'm telling you no. No, what? He asked, suddenly pale. No, to us. It's okay to say yes, Claudia. Why not say yes? You can take care of your aunt and we can see where things go between us. She turned from him. No, we can't. At that, she went upstairs because she knew, like everyone else, he'd leave. When Claudia got to her room, she heard the front door open and close, then she dissolved into tears. Her bedroom window was open and as she watched Carter walk away, she felt the animosity and uncertainty swirling between them like the breeze coming off the sea. She turned on her computer and started typing an email to Professor Prince to inform him she wouldn't be able to complete her assignment. She was concluding the letter when her aunt called her from the other room. She rushed out, leaving it for later.
Chapter 12. Carter. Carter didn't immediately return to the sandy shore inn. Instead, he walked along the beach, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. He picked up a smooth, flat rock and skipped it over the water, but a big wave came and swallowed it up. Claudia's family story was so sad and he'd never opened up and shared his family tragedy with anyone. Everything had been perfect with her just as it had been with his mom and dad. He should have known better than to trust that the beginning of a relationship with the most beautiful woman, inside and out, that he'd ever met could result in anything other than loss. The familiar emptiness he'd tried to fill with fame, with things money could buy, with meaningless time spent with women, seized him. It turned him inside out, leaving him with a hollow ache in his chest. More than anything, other than having Claudia back, he wanted his guitar. Instead, he sat down in the sand and let the melody of the water washing to shore drown out his thoughts. Carter wasn't sure how long he sat in the sand, but he returned to the inn later than usual and slept in until noon the next day, much like he used to when he was on tour. If Claudia didn't want him in her life, he was left with nothing. He dug his phone out of his pocket and dialed his manager, Joey. "I knew you'd be back," Joey said around a whoop of laughter. "We all think a woman is going to fix us, but we're broken men, Wilde. And that's why you're famous. All those female fans want a piece of you because they want to be the one to fix you." He laughed again. The words grazed Carter's awareness as phosphids. He'd left the rehab facility and fixed himself. Claudia hadn't done a thing other than let him fall for her. Admittedly, he'd fallen hard, but the idea that he was irreversibly broken snagged in his thoughts. It just wasn't true. It couldn't be, could it? But Joey went on about interviews and the upcoming tour. Carter had to get together with the band for pre-promo, to practice, and the rest of it. He only half listened. If he couldn't be with Claudia, maybe he should follow through with the tour. "Where are you, anyway?" "I'm sending Alana Winstead from Music Nation Daily for an exclusive interview after Wilde's sudden disappearance and month-long hiatus," Joey said as though reading a headline. The mention of the interview reminded Carter of Claudia's assignment. They'd spent plenty of time together. Hopefully, she had everything she needed. Well, except for one thing. He never told her that he loved her. A heaviness settled over him, pressing him down, keeping him on the phone with Joey as he reviewed the many ways the musician was going to be bigger than ever. It was well past breakfast and even lunch before Carter slogged his way over to the Coconut Cove Café for something to eat. He was in a daze, wondering how he'd practically skipped across the street to the dock for weeks, eager to see Claudia. He could hardly put one foot in front of the other, knowing that things were over between them. From nearby, someone shouted, "There he is." Carter looked up, blinking into the bright sunshine. A gaggle of starry-eyed fans mobbed him. He practically fell over in the sand next to the dock leading to the restaurant. They asked him where he'd been, for his autograph, and snapped selfies. He felt closed in despite the wide blue sky above. He didn't miss the attention at all, and when a sleek black car pulled up, the heaviness that he'd been feeling practically crushed him. They were coming for him. The door opened. A pair of feet wearing stiletto heels emerged, followed by its owner, a woman who'd seen the inside of a plastic surgeon's office countless times and had an artificial personality to match. She wore a tight red dress and looked as out of place in Blue Bay Beach as he suddenly felt as Wilde, the subject of her interview. But he didn't want to draw any more of the chaos his fame caused to the quaint town. He turned from the restaurant and met Alana Winstead, internet gossip extraordinaire, on the street. As he got into the sleek black car, he spotted a gorgeous face gazing at him from the patio adjacent to the cafe. He lifted his hand to wave, but the car pulled away, kicking up sandy dust as it sped out of town. "So, Wilde is back," Alana purred. "Not exactly. Tell us about your sudden departure from the rockers in Rehab show." No comment. The heaviness was still present, but with it also came a hefty sense of resentment. Carter felt all wrong sitting on the leather seat in yet another pair of board shorts he'd bought at the shop in Blue Bay Beach. Not only that, he felt wrong giving an interview. Carter was just a guy who liked to play music. He wasn't the larger-than-life rock star he'd been made out to be. "Rumor has it you found yourself a cute little plaything. Do tell us the details, Wilde." "What's her name?" No comment, he repeated in a low tone of warning. Why had he agreed to the interview? Why had he handed over control of his life to managers, agents, and other people in the music business? He didn't want to give them or Alana anything, not only because it was personal, but because he no longer had Claudia in his life. "Oh. Time away from your handlers has made you feisty. We get a wild version of Wilde. I like it." Alana tossed him a coy smile. "Are you looking forward to the tour this fall?" No comment. When Claudia interviewed him that first time, he'd given the same answer to all her questions much as he was doing then, only he'd give anything to snog Claudia one more time. Alana shifted irritably as though upset her usual tactics weren't getting the results she wanted. "There's a lot of speculation going around. Hoopla and drama surrounding your name. Some say you've thrown your career down the drain." Clearly, she changed her approach. It was odd to think about how the fame and persona was never what he wanted, but he'd let it be constructed around him because he hurt so much after losing his parents. He'd craved the attention, the adulation, and in his loneliest moments, he always had people surrounding him, even if they were just there to snap photos and hear about his crazy antics, most of which were made-up stories. "Others are saying you've lost your edge. Gone soft." Alana needling him, trying to find a weak entry point to get him to reveal something juicy. But all he had was the truth. He was done hiding behind the name Wilde, and Carter wasn't the kind of guy to fake anything. Nor was he someone who'd give up. He sat up a little taller as his resolve lifted the weight that had been burdening him. "My career? I don't know. Just give me a guitar and the girl I love, and I'm golden." "Love?" Alana asked, leaning in. "Wilde is in love?" "No, Carter. Me. Not the British bad boy rock star role I've played all these years." "Tell me more," she said, intrigued. "I'm done faking and hiding things inside. She taught me that. No one can hold a candle to her. She's the light in my darkness." Alana asked a dozen more questions about the mystery woman who tamed Wilde, but he wasn't going to share anything personal. He repeated, no comment, until she finally gave up. He'd said what he needed to say. He told the driver to bring him back to Blue Bay Beach. He forced himself not to gaze out the window at Margot's mansion as they passed so as to not reveal where Claudia lived. He knew if he did, the press and fans would surround the place before long. He didn't want to bring that into her life, but he did want to bring her back into his. As the car pulled in front of the inn, Alana asked, "One more question." "Go ahead. If you give up Wilde, what will happen then?" "I'll just be me. Carter Wilde Westcott." He wouldn't tell her that he was a bit afraid of what the future would bring, but he was ready to find out. The reporter's question followed Carter to his room at the inn. Claudia told him to be himself, but who was that? A guy who loved music, the ocean, pina colada smoothies, his stomach grumbled, and Claudia. Before he went to get food, since he'd missed breakfast and lunch, and before he tried to formulate a plan to win Claudia back, he went to the church in town. Again, it was quiet, but Carter felt a bigger presence that drowned out his doubts. He dropped down to his knees and let the long-held emotions run through him. He let the past go. Then, instead of praying for anything, he filled the Carter's stomach growled again. Feeling lighter than ever, he went to Coconut Cove Café. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew how he was going to tell Claudia how he felt. Unfortunately, Claudia wasn't working. Betty was there, and he realized she was just the person he hoped to see. The older woman with hair as white as the sandy beaches lifted an eyebrow when he sat down in her section. "Come back to beg?" "No, I was thinking more of a gig." She tilted her head in question. "I wrote a song for Claudia and I'd like to play it." "Here." The cook called Betty's name for an order, and as she hurried away, she said, "Hold that thought. I'll be right back." Carter overheard another server named Isley ask a customer if they'd like to donate to the weekly meal program called Coconut Cove Café Special Delivery that the restaurant provided for those in need. A plan formulated in Carter's mind. When Betty finally came back, he placed his order. "More importantly, I'd like to run an open MIC night here at the restaurant. We can take donations for the special delivery program." She nodded. "I like that idea. I'll run it by Billy, but I have a question." "Why? Did you write a love song or something?" Betty waggled her eyebrows. "That's exactly what I did." He smiled. Carter had written half a dozen love songs since meeting Claudia, and they were all for her. He'd found his muse in Blue Bay Beach, and the muse never lied. He'd show Claudia how he felt about her, and he'd tell her the best way he knew how. Through music.
Chapter 13. Claudia. Claudia paced on the lanai. The wind had picked up and the palm fronds rustled in the trees above. The ocean was choppy and the sun hid behind clouds. She hadn't left the mansion since she'd seen Carter walk away from the dock with a leggy blonde dressed in red, and then get in a sleek black car. She guessed he was back to being wild, and everything that went along with that persona, including hooking up with the blonde. She'd never asked if he had a girlfriend. He probably had many, scattered across the cities he visited, like Isley's ex-boyfriend from Baltimore. If Claudia wasn't entirely sure about breaking things off with him before, she definitely was after that spectacle. She'd avoided her phone and friends from work. Aunt Margot mostly slept. She'd become too weak to leave the house, so Claudia had an in-home doctor visit. He informed her that her aunt was in fine health and her confusion and sleepiness was part of the aging process. Thankfully, Claudia had the dogs to distract her. She'd even made them homemade treats. She walked outside to get the mail, and they scattered across the front drive, barking and running in circles. In the stack of letters and collection notices, there was one from Allied Financial, where her aunt had one of her accounts, which Lewis was likely still trying to get his hands on. Without the passwords and Aunt Margot being unable to go to their offices, she wasn't sure how to address the issue. Thankfully, the letter indicated everything was in good standing, meaning Lewis hadn't figured out the passwords yet. She'd have to contact them on the next business day and explain the situation. Claudia called the dogs. "Bella, Bear, Lulu, let's go have a cookie treat." She didn't have much of a sweet tooth, but if Coco's cones delivered, she would have ordered a pint for herself. The dogs were sniffing a bush on the other side of the enclosed driveway area. She called them again. The wind picked up and blew the mail from her hands. She scampered after it, dropping her foot onto the Allied Financial letter so it didn't blow away. "Come on, guys." She picked up the letter. "Bella, Bear, Lulu," she repeated. As soon as the three names were out of her mouth, she felt a zing of recognition rush through her body. Thankfully, it wasn't storming like it had the month before, but she may as well have been struck by lightning, and not the kind that Carter caused. She rushed inside and the dogs followed. After giving them each the cookie she'd promised, she hurried to the office and clicked on the computer. After finding the Allied Financial website, she entered in her aunt's email username, then tried Bella Bear Lulu. Voila! She was logged in. The customer dashboard appeared and indicated Aunt Margot's 7-figure savings. Relief swept through Claudia and she leaned back in the chair. Aunt Margot had said, "The dogs would do a better job of protecting my wealth than that old trout." Indeed they had. She'd be able to pay off the medical debt, whatever other costs they'd incurred for her aunt's care and the bills that were past due. She picked up the phone, ready to call Carter and tell him the good news when she remembered they weren't friends anymore. They weren't anything. A dark, dull feeling took place of the relief. Claudia held her head in her hands as the phone screen dimmed. Before it clicked off, she found the recording of the conversation between her and Louis. She thumbed through Aunt Margot's files until she found her lawyer's information. She went ahead and called the lawyer and the police, prepared to do whatever it took to protect her aunt and her assets. No way was Louis going to interfere again. He'd done enough damage. As she glanced at her wrist to check if it was time to bring Aunt Margot dinner, she realized she'd done a great deal to let go of the past. Including the recent past and the beginning of a relationship with a man who'd proved to quite possibly be the one. He understood her and her need for music. Doubt rippled through her mind. Her phone beeped with a notification from the lawyer, requesting the recording. She sent it and saw that Carter had sent a second audio file. She tapped it. His voice came through her phone, singing about how he'd been broken but found pieces he didn't know he was missing. She caught references to the beach town, to playing the piano, and to her smile, her eyes, his love for her. She clutched the phone to her chest, wishing things were different. When the song ended, she listened to it again before she brought Aunt Margot something to eat for dinner. Claudia sat with Margot as she nibbled a piece of toast. Her appetite had faded to almost nothing. "Do you want to hear something?" she asked. She knew her aunt was tired, but she didn't want her to go to sleep. She missed her sharp intelligence and sense of humor. She missed their shared laughter and her aunt's stories, which were always entertaining, but usually contained a pearl of wisdom. "Sure, darling." Margot's voice was thin. Claudia played the song. It sounded tinny coming from the phone like an old record. As it drew to an end, her aunt's lips lifted into a smile. "Darling, you have no idea how much that young man cares about you. You'd been pining away, searching for the one for years. I've never seen you as happy as you've been since you met him. He seems quite special. You both picked up each other's pieces and found a way to be whole, together." Claudia took her aunt's thin hand then smiled, feeling yet another loss in the woman's awareness. "Thanks. But you haven't met him, Aunt Margot." She wanted to ask if her aunt wanted to do so. Maybe having something to look forward to would keep her from slipping. Perhaps if she invited Carter over to visit, Margot would hold on a little longer. "No, darling. You're right. I haven't met Carter. But I've heard the two of you play the piano together." Claudia's heart pounded out a beat in double time. "It was beautiful. I know you've had to do a lot of letting go in your life, but I wouldn't let him go, darling." Aunt Margot whispered the words. She closed her eyes then in an even lower voice asked, "Will you pray with me?" Claudia squeezed her aunt's hand and the two women prayed until Margot drifted back off. Once she was sure her aunt was peacefully asleep, she slipped out of the room. The sun hadn't quite set yet, so Claudia walked along the beach path to town, then the Coconut Cove Café. Everyone was probably worried since she'd asked for a few days off and hadn't returned their calls or messages. As she neared the dock, the faint strains of two women singing met her ears. The tiki torches on the rails of the restaurant patio were blazing and strings of lights reflected off the water, much like when they'd had the beach blast from the past party. The sun cast the space in golden light as it dipped below the horizon. Isley waved her over. "I hoped you'd come to our open mic night. There's a donation if you want to participate. All proceeds go to Billy's special delivery, getting food to the people in our community who need help." Wow. Whose idea was this? Wait. Let me guess, Betty was behind it. Claudia smiled affectionately. "Well, kind of, but actually, it was." Isley pointed to a guy with shaggy brown hair. Carter sat at a table, clapping for the last act as they left the makeshift stage. He glanced over his shoulder as though wondering who was up next. His gaze landed on Claudia. It felt as if she were the only woman on the patio in the world. His lingering look was like a spotlight, warming her all over. He smirked, raised his hand, then sauntered to the front. He picked up a battered and bruised guitar and strummed. Although there was a decent-sized crowd, she expected loads of fans to spring up from the surrounding water at the sight of Carter aka Wilde playing live. "Is this thing on?" he joked, tapping the mic. Everyone present fell into a hush. "I once wrote a song called Falling Star about how I believed I was like shattered, broken glass reflecting, but not shining, starlight. A special woman recently came into my life and taught me what it is to fall in love. Instead of a feeling of shattering into a million pieces, I now feel whole. As it is, this is my debut song as Carter, the guy formerly known as Wilde." Everyone started clapping, Claudia included. His words were like poetry, but also like the truth, one she was surprised to hear, but one that felt like starlight shone inside of her. Carter played the song on his guitar and it was at once soulful and joyful. Claudia couldn't help herself, but she rushed to the stage when he was done. "That was amazing. You asked me to tell you how I felt. Will that do?" His accent was as charming as ever, but it was his sincere smile and the meaning behind his words that made her bypass a hug and plant a kiss on his lips. "Yes, Carter. That will do." The next act was up and he pulled her to a quiet corner by the tiki bar, which was really just a place for the servers to stash items when waiting tables on the patio. The light of the tiki torches made his gray eyes amber. Doubt flickered inside as she recounted the days since they'd last seen each other. "The song was beautiful, but I have to ask, what about the woman in the red dress?" Claudia asked. "You could be with any girl tonight." "Why me?" "That was Alana Winstead from Music Nation Daily. You should check out the interview." He winked then gripped her shoulders. The weight of his hands, the hands that had strummed the guitar, had danced over the piano keys, and that had held hers, melted some of the tension she carried. "I thought you said I was your first interview, maybe your last." He gave her a gentle squeeze. "I think we can keep what we have just between us. No paparazzi. No spotlight. But if you check out the interview, you'll see that I let the world know how I feel about you." Her heart melted a little more. "I've been with a lot of girls and none of them are you, love." He bit his lip. "I don't use that word lightly either. I love you, Claudia." She lifted her chin and held his gaze. "I should have told you sooner. I love you too." He twisted a piece of her hair. "I've never done this before, you know." "What do you mean?" "I've never asked a girl to go out with me." "Do you mean they all just came crawling, groveling at your feet?" she teased. "Well, no. Yes." He laughed. "But not you. No one is like you, Claudia. I do have one request, but don't make me beg. I need to finish the interview for my project." He strung his arm over her shoulder and led her back toward the open mic stage. I played solo for a long time. Now I want to duet. Can we record it on my phone so I can pass it in to Mr. Prince? Be my guest. First, though, a while ago you said that I have everything I want. That wasn't true. I want you. Will you be my girlfriend? He asked in a tone that was tender yet filled with certainty and resolve. Claudia nodded. Yes, I will be your girlfriend. Carter leaned in and captured her lips. They kissed and the stars inside Claudia lit up and were brighter than the sun, brighter than all the lights in the sky. Afterward, Carter took her hand and led her to the stage where there was a keyboard. He strapped on his guitar. Think we can make this up as we go along? He asked. Isn't that what we've been doing? She started to play a tune on the keyboard and he strummed the guitar. As though channeled from somewhere deep inside or above, they sang about love and kissing, how he was her morning and she was his night, and how they'd always and forever drink milkshakes on the beach under the stars. Epilogue. Claudia and Carter hardly spent a day apart for the rest of the summer, visiting the beach, playing music together and for Aunt Margot. She was usually sleeping, but Claudia thought that the pleasant tunes they wrote together must have been filtering into her dreams. Then on an overcast day late in the season, Aunt Margot didn't wake up. Claudia despaired but knew her beloved aunt was in a better place. Carter stayed by her side during the entire process of celebrating the amazing woman's life and saying goodbye. He even wrote a melody that they played together on the piano at the reception after the funeral. Tears filled Claudia's eyes, but they weren't only from sadness, but all the joy, love, and lessons Aunt Margot had given her, had given everyone she'd encountered. In the days after, the house felt especially empty, silent. Claudia could have filled it with music, but instead, she stepped outside into her aunt's garden. Bella, Bear, and Lulu frolicked around, dodging under the shrubbery. She stood in the center, surrounded by the warmth of the fresh air, the scent of the flowers, and the birds chirping. Claudia closed her eyes and said a prayer, thanking God for the tremendous blessing Margot had been in her life. The woman had loved her like a daughter, had made her feel safe and seen, and smart. She had given her countless gifts, both tangible and in the form of pearls of wisdom. And it seemed even in her passing, she was going to impart one more. How to move on when a person who was at the center of her life had passed, was no longer there to talk to listen to be with. Granted, Aunt Margot's death wasn't surprising and had happened gradually, slowly, so it was no surprise or tragedy other than that it had happened as the natural way of things. Claudia drew a deep breath. Is that another one of your nuggets, Aunt Margot? She asked, not particularly expecting an answer. But from deep inside, one came. So you mean to tell me there aren't any promises in this life? She sighed. And that I should savor every juicy minute. She nodded. Yep, that was exactly what Aunt Margot would say. Claudia turned slowly, enjoying the garden, and vowed to take care of it in Aunt Margot's memory now that the mansion was hers. In fact, as odd as it may have sounded to anyone else, going out there to talk to her aunt felt right, it felt good. She decided she'd put a bench by one of the gardenias and sit out there whenever she felt sad or missed her aunt, or needed advice, or time to think. As she continued in her circle, the silhouette of a man stood outlined in the entryway to the garden. Carter, how long have you been standing there? He strode toward Claudia, freshly showered and shaven. He wore a white t-shirt and brushed his hand through his hair. Long enough to tell you that you're wrong. She tucked her head back. Wrong? There is one promise in this life, Claudia. He gripped her arms and then lowered to his knee. I hope this isn't too soon, but one of the last times I sat with Aunt Margot, you went to let the dogs out. We were talking about the future. I asked if it would be okay if I asked you to marry me. Her hand flew to her lips. Margot thought it was the best idea she'd heard in a long time. But she said I had to do it properly, romantically, and be sure to always let you know how much and how deeply you are loved. He swallowed. Claudia, I know life won't be perfect, things might be hard, like right now. But I can promise you this, I will always love you. My love for you is perfect because it is endless, boundless. It encompasses all things, the good and the bad, the easy and the tough. My love for you stretches beyond time, place, or circumstance. Will you do me the honor of marrying me so I can show you day after day after day and beyond how very true that is, so I can keep my promise? Claudia pulled Carter to his feet, wrapped him in a hug, and then planted a long kiss on his lips. In it, she felt her own love flowing to him, and it was also forever. They parted and they gazed into each other's eyes, sparkling like an infinite sea. Yes, Carter. I will marry you, she said and sealed it with another kiss. The end.